Chapter 451. Vahina fumbled around the cloak for a while and soon found a clue. Spells had a fixed form. Of course, powerful wizards could do whatever they wanted. But generally speaking, they had to follow the basic principles. The witches who lived on the banks of the magic river all year round believed that there were 36,000 runes full of mysterious power in this world. These runes could summarize all the laws of this world, and runic magic and holy magic were built on this foundation. These runes were also the most commonly used activation spells for magical items. For example, the most common ones were Im, Earth, Oss, Wind, Vo, Water, and Flame, Fire. The aura of the earth on the cloak was very strong. In fact, except for the artifacts made by the silver and gold races, most of the treasures in the earliest era came from the elemental realm. Therefore, the noble daughter tried the giant poem, which described the origin of the earth races. There were 1,200 runes in this codex, and it was almost impossible to try them all. But she was very experienced. Usually, the activation spell had to be chosen according to the ability of the magic item, so the range was very narrow. She tried Yala's Tooth and Trembling Rune, which represented shadow. Then, her eyebrows twitched slightly, and she raised her head proudly and handed the cloak to Brando. Her sky-blue eyes were filled with the pride of a young girl, and the corners of her pursed lips could not help but curl up slightly, as if to say, "How is it?" Brando glanced at her and took the cloak. A line of small green words immediately popped up in his vision: King Buni's Cloak of Concealment. Magic resistance 30%. Activation ability: enter a state of concealment for 120 breaths. During this time, the character will disappear from the world, although the character can still feel everything around them. Activation spell: Far. This meant that the equipment had been appraised. The process of finding out the function of a treasure and the activation spell was called appraisal in the Amber world. Appraisal was indeed a profession similar to spellswordsman and curse knight. Spellswordsmen were not swordsmen who used magic. Although they could use magic, their real strength was in analyzing magic to fight against wizards. They were usually more proficient in anti-magic, not magic. However, Brando was not in the mood to think about anything else when he saw this thing. Everything was obscured, the description was as if it had disappeared from this world. He could not help but twitch the corner of his eye. According to the laws of the Amber Sword, omniscient concealment meant that no one existed in any of the main planes of this world, including the material plane, the 4 elemental planes, and the 2 energy planes. Because these 7 worlds overlapped and formed the entirety of Wond, anyone who existed in this world at any moment had to be based on these 7 worlds, just like how humans had to stand on the ground. This was very different from the original invisibility. In the case of mystery spells, invisibility was a spell that used air or water magic to refract light, or to distort the laws of nature to change the path of light to achieve the purpose of deceiving one's vision. In the end, it was just a type of illusion. Although it could not be seen, it could still be heard and smelled. He might even run into something head-on. However, the All Things cloak was much stronger. At least Brando knew that this thing had a simple use, and that was to pass through walls. Because under the effect of omniscient concealment, the walls that existed in this world did not exist to the target. Although the effect only lasted for a short 120 breaths, which was about 5 minutes, it was perfect for escaping. It was not an exaggeration to say that this thing was a divine artifact to those who needed it, and in addition to its 30% magic resistance, it was definitely worthy of its status as a treasure that existed in legends. The legendary cloak hidden in the Giant King's treasure vault did not disgrace its owner in the slightest. Brando raised the cloak and covered the 3 of them. He chanted, "Far." The cloak suddenly became transparent, and the feeling was very strange. It was as if a layer of water was surrounding them. Sifrid's eyes widened as she looked at the scenery around them. She even looked at Brando with admiration. Young people were always able to do things that she did not expect. But Brando himself also took a while to get used to this state. He knew that they were now under the effect of omniscient concealment. In the game, only famous solo players had equipment with such properties, and he had never seen one before. How did you know the incantation? I didn't tell you. Vahina was extremely shocked. She only reacted at this moment and stared at Brando's face in shock. Brando was stunned. He immediately realized that he had made a grave mistake. In the game, once an item was appraised, the player could directly see its properties and use it. But he forgot that this was not the game. It was the same as the appraisal between NPCs. The appraiser needed to describe the function of the equipment. His actions earlier were considered as foresight. Unless he could prove that he had Hoshi Jian's bloodline, there was a high possibility that he would be burned at the stake. Brando's face stiffened. He looked at Vahina's shocked face and did not know where to begin. It did not make sense for him to say that he already had the ability to appraise equipment, or he would not have waited for Vahina to appraise it. But if he did not, then how did he know the incantation to activate it? Didn't you say that it's a passage in the giant's poem? Other than Yala's fangs, which represents the shadow, there's only one other thing that's related to concealment. So I gave it a try. Brendel coughed, his mind turning quickly. Didn't you say that it's a passage in the giant's poem? You succeeded. Vahina asked in disbelief. It was too easy. Then why did they need experts like them to analyze incantations? Why not just make a guess? The girl's eyes widened. She could not help but be shaken, and she felt a great sense of defeat. No, Brando quickly shook his head. At least Vahina did a good job in this matter, and he did not want to hurt her confidence. You've already determined the range. It's not like I can't sense the fluctuation of mana. You know. I'm only a little knowledgeable in legends and myths. Really? Of course, I'm an elementalist after all. How can there be a gold-ranked elementalist in swordsmanship? Vahina pursed her lips in disbelief. Master Von Kane always said that we humans have limited lives. If we don't put all our energy into one thing, I'm afraid that we won't be able to achieve anything. That's not necessarily true, Brando shook his head. Did you forget that I used magic when I took that thing back from you in the Green Tower? You still have the nerve to bring that up. Taking something from a girl. You're such a disrespectful fellow. Vahina could not help but get angry at the mention of what happened in the Green Tower. She snorted, I thought you were a fake noble, a country bumpkin. I didn't expect you to be the real deal. She snorted, Erewhon's people are really rude. Brando wiped the sweat off his forehead. I'm really a fake noble. But he did not agree with Vahina's words. Even though it was wrong to snatch something from a girl, he did not do it for the sake of snatching it. He did it purely to teach a certain someone a lesson for being so self-centered. Anyone would be angry if their item was snatched away while they were bargaining with a merchant, let alone someone who did not follow the rules. Of course, the stone key was still useful to him. That's a different matter. I don't want to discuss who was right and who was wrong with what happened. Brando was in a good mood. He brought Sifrid and Vahina out of the plaza. Andesha was still staring at the forest and occasionally glancing at the world tree, but she did not notice the three people walking through the plaza. On the other hand, the man in the red robe standing on the other side of the ruins didn't notice the presence of the three of them either. Brando felt that the man's figure was somewhat familiar, but he could not see his face clearly at such a distance. But unexpectedly, Vahina spoke up. That person looks familiar. Familiar. Brando was surprised. He had interacted with many high-ranking tree herders in the game, and it was reasonable for him to recognize one of them or hear their voice. But why would a girl from a high-ranking family find a heretic familiar? I think it's that Amon from Braz. I've met him many times with my father when he was still the Bishop of Floral Ridge, Vahina replied, but why is he here? Amon. Brando almost blurted out, how is that possible? He had met Amon before, but he was pushed into the mouth of the Mistborn and died a few hours ago, in Brando's opinion. He saw with his own eyes that the man's heart was pierced, and as far as he knew, no one could survive a pierced heart apart from the Golden Folk. Even angels could not resurrect them. But with Vahina's reminder, the more he looked at the man, the more he found him to be Amon. Although he could not see clearly from this distance, he was not too far off. In fact, he had felt that something was off from the start, but he did not think too much about it. Is it really Amon? Brando could not help but ask, are you sure? You speak so strangely. How can I be sure? I can't see anything from this distance. I just thought it was a casual remark, why are you so serious about it? Vahina grumbled. But for a great cleric to walk together with a heretic from Tree Herders, what a shocking secret. She licked her lips as if she was a little agitated. If it really is him, Brando said in his heart, then it's not as simple as a secret. Resurrecting the dead, especially when the heart was heavily injured, was absolutely impossible with normal methods. The only way was sorcery. To be honest, Brando did not expect Amon to be related to sorcery. That guy was actually a spy. He took a deep breath. He didn't know what he was thinking, but his mind seemed to be filled with all kinds of information. A great cleric of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was actually a tree herder. This news was too shocking. What surprised him even more was that there was no news about it in the game back then. He thought that NPCs did not have any secrets in front of the players. But just as Brando's thoughts were running wild, a voice suddenly came from behind. Who's there, hiding your head and showing your tail? Come out. The voice was slightly hoarse, but the tone was so cold that it sent chills down one's spine. Brando almost jumped when he heard the voice because it did not belong to anyone else. It was Endesha. How was it possible that they were discovered? Brando and Vahina were so scared that they froze on the spot. They looked at each other and saw the shock on each other's pale faces. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 452. Who's hiding there? Andesha's cold voice was like a venomous snake spitting out apricots. Her voice reverberated throughout the plaza, causing Brando and the others to freeze. The woman immediately attacked, but surprisingly, her attack was not aimed at the square, but at the side of the forest. Thick vines danced in the air, and with a boom, several ancient trees were uprooted. As the soil rustled down, a figure suddenly shot out from below. Before Brando could see the figure clearly, the air around him seemed to have stopped flowing, and his vision turned gray. Andesha's whips that filled the sky slowed down in his vision, as if there was a layer of liquid that had increased the resistance. The Grey Domain. The Grey Domain was the ability to change the laws of an area and cause it to enter a world called Grey. This world was located at the boundary between the world of dark energy and the Grey Runic Plains, Earth Elemental. It was a fragmented subworld, and it was one of the many half-planes that were shattered during the War of the Dusk. The War of the Dusk refers to the war between the Golden Age and the Dusk Dragon. After this war, Wond entered the Second Era after the Azure Night shattered the sky. However, the Grey World that Greysword Saint Mephistopheles mentioned was not a real Grey World, but an ability to materialize illusions. It was the ability to project a world that existed in legends into the material world of Wond. Time passivation was one of them. It was one of the most unique elements in this world, and Brando was certain that the figure was Mephistopheles. Why is he here? Brendel took a deep breath, and his palms were covered in cold sweat. This scene was too exciting, and no one would have thought that this would happen in the end. Mephistopheles jumped forward, but it was not easy. He rolled on the ground to avoid Andesha's whips. He stood up calmly and patted the dust off his body. "You're Andesha." Andesha snorted coldly, "Greysword Saint Mephistopheles, the stray dog. Why aren't you looking for trouble with your nemesis, Cruz? What are you doing here?" Mephistopheles ignored her and continued, "Since you're Andesha, then I'm sorry, but I'm here to take your life, that great demon King Mephistopheles. Who does he think he is? How dare he speak to that woman like that?" Vahina was shocked when she heard Andesha's name. "Greysword Saint Mephistopheles. In Cruz. If you don't listen, the great demon King Mephistopheles." But when Vahina saw Mephistopheles, he was not as ferocious as she had imagined. On the contrary, this ash sword saint was a handsome middle-aged man. Andesha was also taken aback. She did not expect Mephistopheles to start a fight after just a few sentences. Mephistopheles unsheathed his sword as soon as he finished his sentence. The huge blade of the sword glowed gray under the sunlight. "Ready." Mephistopheles pointed the sword at Andesha and said in a deep voice, "You." Andesha was furious. "Arrogant." She roared, and the sky above the ruins suddenly turned dark. Lightning bolts as thick as dragons rumbled in the clouds. She pointed downwards, and Brando could see 3 mysterious green runes appearing and disappearing around her. Then, countless bolts of lightning struck down from the sky, as if countless lightning tongues had spat out from the clouds. They gathered at a single point and formed a huge fork of lightning. Brendel knew that this spell was the druid's lightning strike. The 3 runes were lightning, fury, and nature. The lightning bolts created by the lightning strike could be split up to attack each enemy, or it could be concentrated. Each bolt could cause enough damage to kill an ordinary soldier, and the damage would increase according to the caster's bloodline attribute. Each bolt of lightning from Andesha's lightning strike could kill a silver-ranked warrior, and its power was even more shocking when they were concentrated. But it was easy to deal with this lightning strike. All lightning strike spells used metal as their target, and all they had to do was to throw out the most obvious object on their body. But Brando did not expect Mephisto to know the weakness of the lightning strike spell. He immediately threw his long sword to the side, and a blinding ball of lightning gathered on the blade. Ordinary metals would melt under such heat, but magic weapons could absorb the mana in the lightning. The lightning only lasted for a moment before it disappeared, and the sword that was stabbed into the ground was charred black. But Mephisto's sword now had a bolt of lightning as thick as an arm coiling around it, crackling loudly. That sword still has a 40% lightning strike that lasts for 3 rounds, but the damage dealt will not exceed the total damage of the lightning strike spell. Brando muttered to himself, "I've heard that Mephisto is a veteran of many battles against Cruz's forces. It seems like he lives up to his reputation today." "What did you say?" Faina turned her head and asked, unable to hear him clearly. "Nothing." Brando patted Sifrid's head. "Let's leave while they're still fighting. This is a rare opportunity, and it won't come again if we miss it." Faina looked at Mephisto's direction and nodded with lingering fear. Even though Andesha's lightning strike did not cause any real damage, it was still a spectacular sight. The lightning strike was so bright that it looked like the entire world had turned dark, and any normal person would be in awe of such a scene. Mephisto retracted his long sword and turned into a gray shadow that shot towards Andesha's building. But due to his domain, his speed was not fast enough, and Andesha immediately cast a second spell. She summoned the spirit of withering and darkness, and a bloody beast burst out from the ground. It looked like a rhinoceros, but its body was covered in bone plates and spikes. It was about the size of an elephant. This was the tree herder's unique spell, Dark Ally. It was similar to the druid's summoning of animal allies, but the summoned beasts were spirits that had been modified by the blood of gods. She pointed her finger forward, and the rhinoceros charged towards Mephisto. Every time its hooves stomped on the ground, a shock wave would ripple through the ground. If an ordinary soldier was within 10 meters of the rhinoceros, they would have died from the shockwave, not to mention being rammed by the rhinoceros. But this level of attack could only hinder Mephisto's advance. Andesha did not expect the Dark Ally to be able to subdue the Ash Sword Saint. She stretched out her hand, and countless vines parted to reveal a rattan staff. It looked a little disgusting, and the vines on it seemed to be alive as they waved around like tentacles. Andesha gripped the staff tightly. This was the first time she used a weapon. She raised the staff, and a layer of wooden vines immediately extended from her lower body to her lower abdomen, neck, and cheeks. The vines then wrapped around her entire body, forming a layer of wooden armor. Even her hair was wrapped in the vines, forming a kind of tentacle-like hair. Andesha raised the staff, and her snake-like hair fluttered in the wind. She looked like an evil goddess in the legends. Brando and Vahina rushed forward while looking at the situation behind them. When they saw this scene, they could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Damn, that crazy woman is serious. Brando was surprised. He was surprised that Greysword Saint Mephisto was so powerful. He had always thought that Mephisto was slightly stronger than the Cruz Empire's goddess of war, the Azure Sword Saint Veronica, but there was a limit to it. After Andesha finished casting a defensive spell, she raised her head and saw that Mephisto had just killed the dark spirit she summoned. Mephistopheles' method of killing the rhinoceros was too simple. When the dark spirit charged at him, it lowered its head and aimed its sharp horn at him. However, the Ash Sword Saint did not dodge. He grabbed the rhinoceros's horn head-on, and with a loud bang, the rhinoceros that was as big as an elephant was stopped in its tracks. The instant the extreme movement turned to extreme stillness, everyone thought they had seen wrongly. However, the tremendous recoil made the dark spirit's thick, bucket-like limbs fall to their knees. Then, with a loud boom, the rocks on the ground were shattered by the recoil, and the dark spirit sank into a huge pit. When Mephisto released his grip, blood flowed out from the rhinoceros's eyes, mouth, nose, and ears. The gigantic creature was killed just like that. Brando and Vahina were dumbfounded. Is he even human? Even though Brandel's strength was greater than this when he was at his peak, he rarely fought in such a barbaric manner. Who would have thought that Mephisto, a middle-aged man who looked gentle and refined on the surface, would be so violent in battle? However, Brando suddenly felt his blood boiling. He could not help but think that this was what a warrior should be like. A true warrior should charge forward and fight to his heart's content. Once he charged forward, he would strike fear into his opponent's heart. Andesha was not afraid, but she was still shocked. Her face was covered by vines, but her eyes flashed. She waved the staff in her hand and gritted her teeth. Go, my children. The ground suddenly shook, and the huge building behind her instantly fell apart. Countless dragon-like vines rushed out from the ground, and these giant green sandworms bent into a shape in the air before crashing down on Mephisto. Giant plants. Even though Brando did not stop moving, he could not help but stare at this level of battle. It had been a long time since he last saw a battle of this standard, and both sides had rich battle experience. This was because the battle experience of a famous NPC was far greater than that of a normal player. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheatyen.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 453. But when Mephisto displayed his strength, Andesha immediately wanted to use her strength to suppress him. Both of them were prideful people. However, Giant Plant was an 8th Circle Druid spell, and also the highest Circle Druid spell that tree herders could cast. Its effect was to increase the strength of the plants by more than 10 times due to their size. In other words, the power of the vines under Andesha's command was not inferior to a true elemental awakened warrior. The dragon-like vines weaved a net in the air, and under Andesha's command, they sealed off all of Mephisto's escape routes. The Ash Sword Saint had no choice but to face them head-on. But Mephisto did not panic. He slowly came to a stop and raised his head to look at the giant tentacles that were waving in the air. The tentacles pounced towards him. He raised his sword and activated Grey World. Then, he swung the sword upwards with both hands. Even though they were about 100 meters away, Brando and Vahina suddenly felt the world turn dark. It was as if the only thing left in the world was the grey sword in Mephisto's hand. The grey line extended diagonally upwards and divided the world into two. Then, time stopped. With the sound of something breaking apart, the tentacles in the air were all cut off at the same time from their roots. Green liquid gushed out from the severed parts. One could imagine the scene of countless dragons being severed in the air and falling to the ground. It was a spectacular sight. Then, the broken plants fell backward one after another. From mid-air, it looked like a chrysanthemum had bloomed in the forest, but this chrysanthemum was green. The vines fell to the ground with a loud crash and swept through a patch of ancient trees in the forest. Smoke and dust filled the air. Mephisto had expended a lot of energy after using the sword. He propped his sword on the ground and gasped for breath. But Endesha was not in a good state either. Her spell was completely destroyed in an instant, and the backlash from the spell almost caused her to explode. In the end, the woman clenched her teeth and sacrificed herself to save the king. Her left hand exploded into a pile of green paste, releasing all the magic power from her left hand. Only then did she manage to save her life. Endesha snorted and glared at Mephisto. She had never suffered such a loss when she fought against the great mages of the Silver Union. The mages were cautious, and their attacks were predictable, unlike Mephisto, who attacked as if he didn't care about his own life. A moment of carelessness would put her in a passive position. "Hamel, how long are you going to wait, you bastard?" She finally couldn't help but roar. "Do you want to be a bystander so that you can reap the greatest benefits?" Hearing this, Mephisto was shocked. He didn't expect this woman to have helpers. Although he had gained a lot of benefits from the previous attack, that attack had gathered almost the entire power of the Grey Realm. Now, he was also unable to continue the attack and could not even gather the scattered elements. He took a deep breath and looked around. He saw a man wearing a golden-red priest robe walk out from behind the smoke. "Are you a cleric from the Holy Cathedral of Fire?" Mephisto frowned when he saw the man's attire. At this time, Brando also saw the man's appearance. Cleric Amon had almost passed by them. Of course, even if he had passed through them, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. However, after Brando confirmed that this man was indeed the dead Amon, he couldn't help but be shocked. Although this man did indeed look like Amon, his face was as pale as a sheet of wax, and his body was covered with black livor mortis. This was not what a living person should look like, but more like an undead. In Brando's view, this was somewhat similar to an undead resurrection spell. This spell was one of Wone's famous witchcraft. It could turn a person into an undead at the moment of death, but to cast it, a part of the person's soul had to be separated and placed in a container. Of course, this container could not be a jar or a box, but a living person without a soul. As for how a living person could become an empty container without a soul, this went without saying. This forbidden spell was strictly forbidden by the Holy Cathedral, and only the necromancers of Madara and some cultists would study it. Thus, Brando confirmed that Amon was definitely a spy the moment he saw him. However, his relationship with Endesha did not seem to be that of the tree herders. In fact, there were countless cultists in Woned, and the All for One and tree herders were just two of the more powerful ones. Similar to the Silver Heavenly Snake and the Sheephead cult, there were terrifying legends about them everywhere. However, Brando could not help but squint when he saw the black ring on Amon's finger. It seemed that this guy did not intend to return to the Holy Cathedral after his death, so there was no need to hide his identity. The ring was the symbol of the All for One. "It's really him, Cleric Amon." Vahina whispered. Brando nodded. The All-for-One has really infiltrated the human world thoroughly. Even though they were close, Amon did not hear the conversation between Brando and Vahina. He only smiled at Mephistopheles. Good eyesight, but that was just this one's past identity. A dignified cleric of the Holy Cathedral is actually a cultist. The people of Cruz are really depraved. Mephistopheles glanced at Amon and said with some disdain. Count Mephisto, I don't agree with what you're saying. Priest Amon is just one of the rare examples. Besides, Priest Amon isn't from Kurlutz. How can you generalize? A voice suddenly came from the other side of the fog. Brando raised his eyebrows when he heard this voice. Veronica, why is she here? But what surprised him even more was that this Cruz goddess of war seemed to be on the same side as Mephistopheles. How did they get together? He thought that the Ash Sword Saint would never compromise with anyone from Cruz even if the world fell apart. But before Veronica's voice died away, a green light flashed from the other side of the fog. At that time, Amon was about to attack the immobile Mephisto, but the sound of flapping wings suddenly came from the fog. Following that, a flock of green birds suddenly broke out of the fog, flapping their wings as they rushed towards him. The birds seemed to be made of light, and their blue indigo colors were beautiful enough to take one's breath away. But Amon's expression changed when he saw them. These beautiful creatures were actually dangerous, and every feather on their body was sharper than a real longsword. This was because they were made of Veronica's sword aura. Sky Wall. Vahina couldn't help but shout when she saw these green birds. It's Lady Veronica. Amon immediately retreated, and 8 runes appeared one after another around him. Then, a hexagonal wall of light suddenly appeared in front of the green birds. The birds crashed into the wall one by one, causing ripples, but they all disappeared in the end. Brando recognized this spell as one of the strongest defensive spells of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Divine Shield. The effect of this spell was to block all attacks, but Amon's spell was obviously much weaker. It seemed that his compatibility with this type of spell had decreased a lot after turning into an undead. Perhaps in a few days, Amon would completely lose these spells, but at least for now, he could still be considered a powerful cleric. Amon took a step back and looked warily at the lady who came out from the fog. However, Brando looked at the long sword in Veronica's hand with a strange expression. If he wasn't wrong, that sword should be the Ash Sword's backup weapon, the runic sword Gunnies. Since when did the two of them have such a good relationship that they could even exchange backup weapons? Could it be that the Ash Sword Saint's hatred for Cruz's people was just a lie? Or did Veronica cast some kind of spell on him? Brando looked at Veronica and couldn't help but think with a hint of malice. The goddess of war of the Empire was over 100 years old, but she looked like she was in her early 30s. She was still very attractive to Mephisto. Although the Ash Sword Saint was younger, the difference in age wasn't that big. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. Could it be that the Ash Sword Saint and the goddess of war of the Empire had really fallen for each other? It wasn't impossible for them to forget about each other with a smile. Hey, Vahina, Brendel couldn't help but ask, why are they together? Did Lady Veronica use the legendary honey trap on Mephisto? Don't talk nonsense, Lady Veronica wouldn't do that. Vahina looked at the scene with her mouth agape, and said with a little lack of confidence. But even though Brando was spouting nonsense, he was still a little worried. He looked around, hoping that Scarlet didn't follow them. Unfortunately, he was disappointed because he soon saw the girl behind Veronica. Sigh, aren't you just causing trouble for me, Lady Veronica? Brando sighed when he saw Scarlet. Let's go out and meet up with Lady Veronica. Vahina suggested softly. Brando immediately grabbed her arm. Wait, let's see what happens first. What's there to see? Your little lover is here, are you not going to stay? Vahina looked at him from the corner of her eyes. Hey, aren't you a noble's daughter? How can you say something like that? Brando couldn't help but cough. Besides, are you stupid? We're in the dark while the enemy is out in the open. Why do you have to go out and let them be on guard? Vahina was stunned. She didn't expect Brando to come up with such an idea. She blushed. Of course not, it's just that I'm not as despicable as you, always thinking about sneak attacks. Are you a noble or not? Aren't backstabbing, poisoning, and assassination your Kurlut's noble specialties? It seems like what I'm doing is in line with your values, right? Brendel replied. Vahina was speechless. She turned around and glared at him with gritted teeth. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 454. When Veronica walked out of the fog, the priestess of the former holy cathedral was just as shocked as Brando. Before he could react, the Azure Lady spoke to him. Priestess Amon, you really surprised me. You too, Lady Veronica. Amon replied with a solemn expression. What a surprise. Greysword Saint Mephistopheles is actually working with the people of Cruz. Andesha covered the wound on her left arm with her right hand. Green blood flowed out from between her fingers, but she spoke coldly as if she did not feel any pain. You stray dog over there. Is your hatred for the people of Cruz so shallow? Brando saw that the Sword Saint of Ashes did not show any expression in the face of such mockery. He just stood there as if he did not hear anything. Brando could not help but admire the Sword Saint for his magnanimity and self-restraint. But he did not expect the legendary Sword Saint to raise his head and ask seriously, your sister. Are you a natural idiot? Brando almost choked to death. He could not help but curse in his heart. The Sword Saint of Ashes was the representative of the NPCs who were fearless. He was the idol of countless people, but he did not expect him to be like this. This was the effect of a deified idol collapsing in one's heart. Even though Brando was not a fanatic, the contrast was too great. Andesha's face darkened. Of course, she did not think that Mephistopheles did not hear her words. She thought that he was just teasing her. In other words, he did not even put her in his eyes. Andesha had been an elemental power for close to 200 years, and she had never been looked down upon like this. For a moment, she felt the blood in her body boil. She pointed at Mephistopheles and growled in a low voice, Mephistopheles, 30 years ago I heard that you were the genius of the Mayor people. The Cruz Empire did not hesitate to send troops to suppress the Sutherland Duchy in order to strangle you in the cradle. Fortunately, that woman, Martha, still cares for you. But it is a pity that you did not cherish it and walk together with your former enemy. You are indeed a genius with your talent, but you are still too far away from me. You should know that I underestimated you and let you take advantage of me, but this kind of situation will not happen again. Cherish your life, young man. Besides, the woman behind you is the goddess of war of the Cruz Empire. Killing her will be a heavy blow to that arrogant empire. You should know this, right? Mephistopheles nodded. I know it, Lady Andesha. But I am here to take your life now. As for my grudge with the Cruz Empire, I will settle it myself later. Don't refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. Andesha gritted her teeth. It was not that she did not dare to make a move against Mephistopheles. She had already grasped his strength in the previous battle. As long as she did not underestimate him, Mephistopheles would not stand a chance. However, she wasn't willing to fight to the death with Mephistopheles. To put it bluntly, she didn't trust Hamel who was with her. She was very clear that that fellow could stab both of them in the back at any time. But when Mephistopheles heard her, he raised his sword and replied, I don't drink any wine. You should know that things that corrode one's mind are harmful to those who pursue the pinnacle of swordsmanship. Yes, and Andesha, you should know that both the Cruz Empire and the Mayor Empire are Martha's people. They are different from monsters like you. To us, you are the greatest enemy. Even if Count Mephistopheles has a grudge with the Cruz Empire, you should still unite against the common enemy, right? Veronica raised her head and crossed her arms as she spoke to Andesha with a smile. This female commander had long green hair that draped over her shoulders, and her smile was exceptionally charming. Andesha was furious. Then you can die. Corrosion, I will show you the power of time. A green domain spread out behind the enraged lord. Everything that was enveloped by the green light was instantly weathered and disintegrated. The stone buildings that had been preserved for tens of thousands of years crumbled under the green light, turning into mud and sand that fell to the ground. The green light extended forward and surrounded Mephistopheles and Veronica in an instant. It looked as if it was about to swallow them whole. Unexpectedly, the green light stopped when it was within 100 feet of the Ash Sword Saint's body. It couldn't advance any further. The streets around the green light turned into fine powder, and the stone slabs cracked to reveal the soil beneath. Plants grew and withered from the exposed soil, and the ground turned dark. But the streets beneath Mephistopheles' feet did not change at all. What's going on? Andesha was slightly shocked. Mephistopheles' strength was much weaker than her, and he should not be able to resist her element corrosion. What's going on? Faina, who was hiding under the cloak, also asked in confusion. How is he able to resist the effects of element power from such a long distance? Is he as strong as Andesha? When she discovered that Mephistopheles was on Veronica's side, she changed her title from Great Demon King to That Guy. Element corrosion. Brando's eyes lit up. Corrosion is just a low-level element corrosion, and it is at most on the same level as the dominant element corrosion. But the law of gray is the strongest element illusion, and it is also related to time. In the world of gray, time slows down, and corrosion is naturally ineffective. And the elements of illusion are mostly self-determined laws. In that world, the low-level elements of time have to obey the laws of that world. Brando did not say anything else, because the so-called elements were divided into 6 levels: micro-elements, mixed elements, strong elements, law power, elemental power, and existential power. Micro-elements were the power that everyone in the world of Woned had. They were also known as the human attribute, but they were not visible and were weak to the point of being undetectable. Mixed elements were the manifestation of strong elements, and they were also known as dominant elements. Most of these elements would appear before a person had truly awakened their element, such as the freeze ability that Brando had displayed. But only those who had truly awakened their element could possess dominant elements. This level was known as the strong element, and it was also the most widely distributed element in the world. Above that was the power of law, such as fantasy, mystery, divine, and nature. After that was the power of elements, which was also known as the highest level of elements. The 4 elements belonged to this level of elements, which was the foundation of this world. Lastly was the existential power, which was parallel to or beyond the definition of the world itself. It was the foundation of the existence of matter and consciousness. Andesha's corrosion was only a low-level element of nature, and its highest level was time. Even though it was of noble origin, it was only a low-level element that was at the level of a strong element. On the other hand, the world of gray of the Ash Sword Saint was a genuine fantasy element. Both elements contained the element of time, but Andesha's power was suppressed due to the fact that the low-level element had to obey the high-level element. If not for the fact that she was much stronger than Mephisto, Mephisto could have even used the world of gray to control her element. You're really lucky, Count Mephisto. Veronica laughed behind Mephisto. Even though she knew how dangerous Andesha's element was, she did not seem to be bothered by it. The young sword saint of the Mayor Empire turned around to look at her, and his dark gray eyes said, I already know about Andesha's abilities. I see. Veronica replied. She reached out to protect Scarlet behind her and said to the red-haired girl, "Back off a little, you won't be able to interfere in the battle." Scarlet showed a surprised expression. "You don't have to protect me, Lady Veronica. I'm also a gold-ranked fighter." "Oh." Mephisto was slightly surprised. "Your lord is also a gold-ranked fighter, isn't he? The Erewhon Empire has produced quite a few people in recent years. I heard that there's a young man called Bugha who has outstanding talent and obtained the recognition of the Cross-Sword Saint. Is he also from your empire?" Scarlet nodded. Bugha was her vice-commander. However, she did not dare to say that the young Bugha was no longer young. He was already middle-aged. "You don't have to look at me." Veronica saw the Sword Saint of the Mayor Empire looking back at her and could not help but grumble. "You don't really believe that woman's nonsense, do you? The Empire did not send troops to the Sutherland Duchy because of you, the Duke's son. Besides, don't worry, I'll do what I say." "That's good." Mephisto raised his sword. "I'll deal with that woman, and you deal with the cleric. Is that all right?" "No problem, Amon is not as strong as me," Veronica replied. "That's not necessarily true. You have to be careful," Mephisto said. He then added, "I'm not worried about you, I just don't want you to be a burden to me." Veronica glared at him. No one had ever dared to speak to her like that ever since she became famous. Besides, she was older than this young sword saint. However, Mephisto ignored her and turned his head back without saying a word. The conversation between the three of them happened in an instant, and Endesha also noticed the problem. She was so shocked that her face became distorted. Even though her element power was suppressed, it did not mean that she could not do anything to Mephisto. She was the Lord of Tree Herders, and she did not rely on her element power to survive. She let go of her right hand that was covering her left arm and grabbed the wooden staff that was floating in the air. Her eyes were almost spitting fire as she glared at the people below. She gripped her scepter tightly and shouted, "Oh, primal chaos above all things, I revere your power with all my heart. May your wrath and anger burn away all existences that violate the truth of this world. Now, let me borrow your authority and do your thing." A terrifying chill ran through everyone's heart. "Seventh moon, I call upon your name, Ankaram, and all things return to the same path." Endesha raised her staff and pierced through the vines covering her body. Black scales that flowed with blood grew out from her body. "Come, Dragon of Chaos, Dusk." Note, Ankaram is the name of the seventh moon. The witches believe that this moon is the reflection of the shadow and destruction magic in the sky. It represents the brutality and killing intent of the Dusk Dragon. Ankaram and the fourth moon, Akana, are twins. Akana represents judgment and rebirth in the legends of the Crews, and is also the moon of wisdom for the Bugha Magi. Horns grew out from her hair, and the sun in the sky dimmed. A pair of wings covered in scales spread out from her back. She shook her head and tail, and her neck lengthened. Her fingernails became sharp, and her body grew bigger and bigger. She's really angry now. Take Sifrit and find a place to hide. Don't get too close, or the wind blades from the battle will scratch your face. Don't blame me for not warning you, Brendel said to Faina as he pulled out Halran Gaia from his back and gripped the hilt tightly. Find a place to hide with Sifrit and don't get too close. Why you? I am not afraid. I want to go as well, I'm a warrior too. Vahina's eyes widened as she reached for her dagger, but she remembered that she had lost it earlier. I can use magic to help you. You want to go? Brando looked at her. Are you saying that you want to leave a child like Sifrit alone on this battlefield? You're really vicious, woman. Vahina was at a loss for words. She glared at him. All right, I understand. But if you lose, I'll make fun of you. Lose? Brando looked at the battlefield outside. Even if I lose, I don't need you to make fun of me. No one here will be able to survive. However, he was more concerned about Amon. He knew that he could not interfere in the battle between Andesha and Mephisto. He raised his sword and stared at the battlefield, waiting for Amon to exchange blows with Veronica before launching a sneak attack from the back. However, if the young miss beside him knew what he was thinking at this moment, she would probably scold him for having a dark heart and only thinking about sneak attacks. But in Brando's eyes, he would be a fool if he did not launch a sneak attack. Ambushing NPCs was a player's specialty, and it would be a waste if he did not use it. Heh, you probably don't know who Song Xianggong is, little girl. This is the power of transmigration, and chaos is nothing compared to it. He glanced at Vahina, then at Andesha, who had completely transformed into a dragon. Instead of criticizing her, it would be better to say that he was encouraging himself. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 455. But you can help me with something. Brando turned around and said to Faina. Help. Faina looked at him with a puzzled expression. Analyze the runes on Amon's body and tell me the parts that are related to defense. Are you going to deal with Amon first? Nonsense, of course I'll pick the weakest persimmon first. Brando stared at Amon's back and said. He had another choice, which was to take control of Valhalla's core while Andesha fought with Veronica and Mephisto. But he chose to stay because of two reasons. The first was because of Scarlet. It was not a short distance from here to Valhalla's core, but Mephisto was obviously not Andesha's opponent. Leaving Veronica and Scarlet here was not a wise decision. But the more important reason was that he found an opportunity. Andesha and Amon were tree herders and All for One. All for One's influence was deep in human society, and the tree herders were a bunch of lunatics. Brando did not wish for them to return to the civilized world and become his enemy. The only way was to get rid of these two people here and let everything that had happened here be buried in the Black Forest forever, eliminating all future troubles. That was why he tried to instigate William, but the Archmage of the Silver Alliance was too cautious and did not let him gain any advantage. But now, Mephisto's appearance gave him a second chance. Brando knew that Andesha's most troublesome aspect in battle was her corrosive domain, but the Ash Sword Saint was able to counter it. In this way, Andesha's well-concealed weakness was exposed. All right, I'll try, Faina replied, but his level is too high, I can't guarantee that it'll work. Don't worry, Brando comforted her, he's already an undead, the holy spell will reject his body and manifest itself. It's not as difficult as you think. Faina nodded. The Lady of Azure approached Amon and looked at him. Priest Amon, it's not too late to turn back. I don't want to attack you because of our personal friendship in the Empire. Turn back. Amon sneered. Will the Holy Cathedral accept an undead as their priestess? Besides, you should have heard of the resurrection of the undead spell, right? Veronica, don't try to flatter me. You know that it's useless to me. Veronica was not surprised by Amon's answer. She just wanted to shake his mind, but the will of the undead was as cold as steel. It did not affect the fallen priest at all. Without another word, she flicked the sword in her hand, and a string of green birds flew out from the sword. They flew in a beautiful arc towards Amon from both sides. Amon pointed his finger. Golden flames, give me a shield. Several golden shields appeared and disappeared, each colliding with one of the green birds and causing sparks to fly in the air. Blessing of Flames. Faina said. This spell is an active defensive spell, but if the caster is unable to detect it, then it's useless. Continue. Brendel stared at the gap behind Amon's back as he spoke with Halran Gaia. There's also a spirit barrier. It's a passive defense. It only protects the front 180 degrees. What else? Arcane armor. Foresight attack. That's a little troublesome. That's all. I think, that's all. Brendel nodded and lifted his cloak with one hand. At this moment, Amon was in the midst of a fierce battle with Veronica. He did not expect 3 people to be hiding less than 10 feet away from him. With his abilities, it was impossible for someone to hide at this distance without him noticing, unless they were 10 times stronger than him. But then again, it didn't make much of a difference whether or not someone who was 10 times stronger than him sensed his presence. Besides, Amon definitely wouldn't think that someone who was 10 times stronger than him would sneak up on him. There was no need for that. The moment Brendel took off his cloak, the foresight attack on Veronica immediately alerted him, but he was too busy fighting with Veronica and did not have time to turn around. Moreover, the warning from the spell was not strong, which meant that the people who were hostile towards him were still some distance away. Unfortunately, what Amon did not know was that Brando also knew how the foresight attack worked. He calmed his breathing from the start so that his killing intent was not that obvious. As a true veteran player of the Amber Sword, Brando had a wealth of experience. He was even more dangerous than the mage hunters. The moment he appeared, Veronica saw him and Vahina behind him. The woman's eyes lit up. She was curious as to why he was here, and why did he not let her and Amon notice him at such a close distance. But despite her doubts, the woman's expression was calm. She did not alert Amon at all. As a female general who had experienced hundreds of battles, being calm in the face of danger was the most basic quality of a general. Brando was well aware of this, and he believed that the war goddess of crews would not disappoint him. As expected, not only did Veronica not expose his presence, but she also immediately understood his tactic and took a step forward to attack. "Oh, you also noticed that reinforcements are coming? But it's useless. That brat should still be far away. This little bit of time is more than enough for me to deal with you, Veronica." Amon was still talking to himself. "Priest Amon, did I not know that depravity can make people arrogant?" Veronica smiled faintly. "Behind you, idiot." At this moment, Andesh's shrill voice suddenly came from above. Amon was startled, suddenly shocked. But at this moment, Brando had already made his move. The arcane armor on Amon was a triggered full-body defense spell. It was also the most effective weapon a wizard could use against rogues. Arcane armor and predictive attack was the common choice of all high-level mages in the early stages of the game. It was also the reason why the nightingales complained to the heavens. But it was only useful in the early stages of the game. The player's creativity was limitless, and a battle between a spear and a shield would never end with one side winning. Brando did not directly stab Amon's back with his sword. He raised his right hand and chanted, "OSS." A wind bullet was shot out and hit Amon's back with a loud bang. The arcane armor on Amon's body reacted immediately. A layer of silver-white square-shaped light spots appeared on his back like fish scales. The layers of light deflected the wind bullet's lethality into nothingness. But after the silver light appeared, it quickly weakened. The arcane armor could only block one attack in a short period of time. Brando knew this very well. He took the opportunity to deceive the arcane armor and immediately slashed at Amon. After breaking through the arcane armor, Amon was no better than an ordinary person in front of Brando even though he had elemental power. This was the biggest weakness of priests and wizards, their physical strength was too weak. The Halran Gaia cut through Amon's back like cutting through tofu. The high priest screamed and fell forward. Veronica's sword pierced through his lower abdomen, and Amon howled in pain again. But even so, the undead spirit did not suffer any fatal injuries. It took a step back, pulled out its sword, and turned around in a panic to escape. A zombie. Brando was stunned. "Cut off his head, Miss Veronica. Don't even think about it." Amon howled with hatred. He raised his hand, and the red bracelet on his hand exploded with a bang. A A circle of white lights suddenly enveloped him, and he disappeared. When he reappeared, he had fallen 100 meters away with an arrow in his back. Brando spat and looked in the direction of the corpse. He put down the shale longbow in his hand and said, "Isn't it just a anywhere door? You think I can't tell where you're going?" Veronica stood aside and looked at him with a smile. "Brando, where did you get your combat experience?" "In crews, even the best young knight I've seen is not as good as you. I'm a descendant of the Highland Knight. Fighting with mages is a talent that I inherited from my bones." Brando replied casually as he returned the blue firmament to Veronica, "Go deal with Andesha. I have a way to kill her." Veronica looked at him curiously. Brando shook off the blood on his sword and looked at Andesha, who was not far away. Andesha had been paying attention to the battle. When she saw that Amon had failed, she could not help but stare at Brando with hatred. However, at this moment, the woman had turned into a black dragon. She was entrenched on top of the building like a giant beast lurking in the shadows. Even though she herself was the shadow. The battle had become 3 against 1, but Andesha did not show any signs of retreating. The leader of the tree herders had her own pride. She did not care about Brando and Veronica in the first place, and did not think that these two people who were much weaker than her could pose a threat to her. "How do you plan to deal with that woman? She's not an ordinary person." Veronica looked at Brando and asked. "I have my ways. Actually, I suggest that you bring Vahina and Scarlet away from here." "Brando, Andesha is not that easy to deal with. I'll convince Mephistopheles to delay her. What about you?" Brando turned to look at Veronica. "Me? As a general of the Empire, dying in battle is not a disgrace." Veronica smiled. "Vahina's identity is special, I have to protect her. It's not that serious. Even though Andesha has turned into a dragon, she only has the physical defense and strength of a race that inherited the golden bloodline." Brando sheathed Halran Gaia and walked towards Andesha. "The true strength of the dragon race is the magic that flows through their bodies. You should know that the silver elves and humans' knowledge of magic comes from the dragon race, right?" Veronica nodded. "That's why Andesha's strength has its weakness." Brando lowered his voice. "She's a druid after all. As long as her connection with nature is cut off, she'll be useless." "That won't be easy. But it's not like there's no way." Brando said, "If there's anything in this world that can cut off the connection between a region and nature, it would be the golden demonic tree." "The golden demonic tree?" Brando nodded. "Is Andesha digging her own grave by injecting the blood of gods into me? P.S. A classmate told me that I didn't post it yesterday, but I realized that I didn't post it yesterday. I'm sweating like a waterfall." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 456. Faina stood on the battlefield with Sifrid in her arms. She suddenly felt someone pulling her from behind. She turned around and saw a red-haired girl with a ponytail looking at her sternly. "Don't stand here, it's too dangerous." As he spoke, he pulled her back without giving her any chance to explain. "Scarlet. Sister Scarlet." Scarlet patted Sifrid's head and said to Faina, "Come with me. You can't interfere in the Lord's battle, and this place will be affected by it." "What? He only dares to fight because of the Sword Saint. Wasn't he just as afraid of that woman as we were?" Faina replied in annoyance, but she did not dare to continue when she saw Scarlet glaring at her. "Sister Scarlet, look over there." Sifrid tugged at Scarlet's sleeve. The ponytailed girl was startled and raised her head in confusion. Brando said that he would use the golden demonic tree to absorb the force of nature in an area. Of course, he could not plant the golden demonic tree in a battle, but it was enough to achieve a certain effect. Andesha and Mephisto were currently fighting in the air. The Withered Lord had the upper hand in terms of strength, but Mephisto relied on his techniques to remain undefeated. Both of them noticed Brendel and Veronica on the ground, but Andesha slyly avoided Mephistopheles from moving the battlefield to the ground to avoid being caught in a pincer attack. "Your helpers aren't useful," Andesha sneered. Mephisto didn't have the time to reply, and his calm eyes showed that he didn't want to answer. Or rather, his answer was the giant sword in his hand. The giant sword stabbed forward, and a 100-meter-long blade of light was formed by Grey Sword Chi. Andesha snorted and turned her huge body in midair to avoid the sword. She swept her wings that were covered with steel scales and knocked Mephisto's sword aside. She then clawed at Mephisto's head. At the same time, she tried to set up a small area of lightning storm behind Mephisto so that she could use this level 5 spell to seal off his escape route. Andesha's claws were fast and vicious, and Mephisto's head would have been turned into a ragged sack if she had hit him. But at this moment, the woman realized that her spell was one step too slow. The lightning that should have been summoned in an instant was dodged by the human sword saint. "What's going on?" Andesha was shocked. She realized that the flow of mana in her body had slowed down by a fraction. Although it was only a fraction, the slightest change in the flow of mana would alert any caster. Andesha lowered her head and immediately noticed Brando's actions. It wouldn't be appropriate to call it a small trick. This was because Brando was letting the blood flow down from his wrist and onto the shrubs on the ground. As he walked forward, the shrubs immediately grew crazily and formed a black belt. Golden Tree. Andesha didn't think about how Brando knew the secret of the Golden Tree, but she knew that the Golden Tree had the ability to disrupt the flow of nature. She was shocked and angry, and immediately threw Mephisto aside and swooped down. At this moment, Brando and Veronica heard a sharp whistle and felt the sky above them turn dark. They looked up and saw a black cloud pressing down on them. Veronica's expression darkened, and she immediately pulled out her sword to block in front of Brando. On the other hand, Mephisto naturally wouldn't allow Andesha to change her target so easily. Although he didn't know what Brando was doing, he could clearly feel that Andesha's spell had slowed down by a fraction. Looking at the monster's reaction, he could guess that it was related to the youth below. Mephisto pursed his lips and immediately turned his sword to stab at Andesha's exposed back. "Scram, you wretched vermin!" Dark lightning. The tree shepherds, lord of the withering trees, let out an angry roar, and black lightning began to appear around her body. These lightning bolts seemed to listen to her commands as they crisscrossed through the air, and a few of them struck Mephisto's sword. The sword saint of Sutherland felt his hand go numb, and a huge force came from his sword, causing him to almost lose control of it. The power of the lightning was extremely strange, and it didn't have the numbing effect of ordinary lightning. Instead, it had a burning sensation that pierced his heart. Mephisto immediately switched his sword to his left hand, and when he looked at his right palm, there were no traces of burns. Instead, it was completely black. Corrosive damage. The sword saint was slightly stunned. He was quite knowledgeable, and he recognized that this wasn't ordinary lightning, but a substance formed by the element of darkness. However, while the sword saint of Ash was obstructed by Andesha, the evil dragon had already arrived above Veronica and Brando's heads. She circled in the air and attempted to stop Brendel, but Veronica stood in front of Brendel and raised the azure firmament in a battle stance. Andesha took a deep breath. She knew that if she wanted to attack Brando, she couldn't avoid Veronica. Even though the crew's goddess of war wasn't as strong as her, she had no problem obstructing her from the side. She hesitated for a moment, then stretched out her claws. Countless vines grew out from the ground and pierced towards Brando. The vines were twisted plants that had been corroded by the darkness, and when they broke out from the ground, they looked like countless poisonous snakes. Veronica frowned and had to lead the vines to the side to prevent them from affecting Brando's work. How much longer? Don't fight her head on. Let Mephisto stall her. Brando replied without raising his head. He stared at the bushes on the ground. Under the nourishment of the blood of gods, the black thorns grew at a speed visible to the naked eye. Andesha became anxious when she saw this. Even though the plants weren't enough to completely distort the natural order of this place, it was enough to affect her connection with nature. She was a druid, and after losing the magic that she was so proud of, her close combat ability wasn't much better than Mephisto's. With Veronica at the side, her chances of victory were even lower. Especially in a battle of their level, victory and defeat were often decided in an instant. The slightest tilt in the balance of a battle could affect the final outcome. She immediately lowered her head and let out a low growl. The vines that came out from the ground were closing in on her, and Veronica was completely entangled by them. Andesha narrowed her eyes and took the opportunity to fly towards Brendel's direction. She did not care if she had 100% chance of success. She opened her wings and flew towards Brendel's direction. A terrifying shriek rang out in the air. Brando finally raised his head and looked at the direction where Andesha dove towards with a calm expression. Of course, he was extremely nervous at this moment. Even the most dangerous mission in the past wasn't as exciting as this moment. She was one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders. She was at least 40 levels higher than him, and if it was in the game, she could kill him with a single breath. It wasn't as simple as losing a level in the game, but a real death. But Brando's mind was extremely clear at this moment. He glanced to the side and noticed Veronica's situation, and a plan formed in his mind. He came up with a countermeasure in an instant and swung his sword towards Veronica's direction. Even though the crescent-shaped sword chi from the White Raven sword style bounced off the vines without causing any damage, Brando didn't count on it. With a thought, a sharp rock pierced out from the ground. It didn't pierce through the vines, but it temporarily blocked them from the other side. Veronica was finally able to escape. She took a step forward and raised her sword without any hesitation. Green light radiated from her body and surged out in all directions. She raised Cyan Firmament and swung it at Andesha. A cyan wind dragon that was 1/10 of Andesha's size flew out from the blade and crashed into the evil dragon in midair. Andesha was in the final stages of her dive and couldn't change her direction. She could only watch as the wind dragon crashed into her shoulder. Of course, the wind dragon was only an illusion. In reality, the sword chi tore through the scales on her shoulder, causing blood to spurt out. But that was all. Andesha only felt intense pain, and her movements slowed down slightly. Brando took the opportunity to dodge her claws and regroup with Veronica on the other side. Lady Withering was furious and wanted to chase after him, but a chill ran down her spine and she stopped. She turned around and saw that Mephisto had already torn apart the black lightning and was chasing after her. Even though Andesha was dispirited, she had no choice but to turn around and fight. She wasn't so careless as to expose her back to the sword saint of the Mayor tribe without any preparation. Mephisto had already used his strength to tell the tree herders that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Brando took the opportunity to scatter the black thorns on the ground. These thorns were cultivated on the spot, and their effects were minimal. At least from the young man's point of view, he would need at least 4 more thorns of the same size to turn the tide of the battle. This wasn't an easy task because Andesha was constantly trying to stop and destroy the fruits of his labor. At first, she used a more direct method, but Mephisto didn't give it to her for nothing. Even though the sword saint of the Mayor tribe seemed a little off the mark, he could see that Brando's thorns were the key to turning the tide of the battle. Andesha's spells were getting slower and slower, and Mephisto's battle was getting easier and easier. There were even times when he had the chance to counterattack, which was unimaginable in the beginning. Thus, he decided to follow behind Andesha like a haunting ghost, not giving her any chance to make a move. Andesha quickly realized Mephisto's tactic, and she had no choice but to stop her clumsy actions and use her element of corrosion to corrode the thorns. This had a miraculous effect in the beginning, and almost caused Brando's work to go to waste. However, Mephisto quickly found a way to defend himself under Brando's guidance. He simply used his ashen world to cover the black thorns, preventing Endesha from attacking. This move almost drove Endesha crazy, but there was nothing she could do. Her element of corrosion couldn't do anything to Mephisto. Both sides chased after each other, and the black, great wall was slowly built. Even though Brando was starting to feel dizzy due to the excessive blood loss, Endesha's battle prowess was also starting to crumble. Her last spell almost failed, and the backlash from the spell almost caused her to lose an eye. Thus, a strange scene appeared on the battlefield. One of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders was being dragged into the abyss by an unknown noble called Erwin. Even Mephisto, who was fighting against Endesha, could not believe his eyes. Veronica was supporting Brando. Endesha was furious, but she finally started to feel a little uneasy. She knew that there was no other way out but to lose. The leader of the tree herders finally regained her senses. She turned around in midair and prepared to escape. "Don't let her escape!" Brando immediately shouted. The Golden Tree's area of influence was large enough to cover an entire valley, and it was already too late for Endesha to think of escaping. But at this moment, he heard Scarlet scream, "Be careful, my lord." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 457. Be careful. Scarlet suddenly shouted as Brando focused on dealing with Endesha's attack. Brando's heart skipped a beat as he turned around, only to see a ray of black light coming at him. Brando did not have time to react, but his rich combat experience made him lunge forward. He felt a sharp pain in his back as he was shot. Damn it! Brando cursed as he gritted his teeth in pain. He had already guessed who the attacker was, and the only one who could have attacked him from that direction was Amon. But he was surprised that Amon did not die. After taking a hit from Halran Gaia, he was hit by an arrow as well. Damn, is that guy a cockroach that can't be killed? In Brando's experience, a cleric was just a cloth armor class. He would not survive such an attack, even if he was an undead. He immediately turned around and saw Amon crawling up from the rubble, stones and debris falling from his body. However, the priest who betrayed the Holy Cathedral of Fire was equally surprised. He probably did not expect Brendel to be able to dodge his attack. Ha! He looked at Brando with a strange expression and said, "I have seen the most elite soldiers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire before. You are not as simple as a nobleman of Erewhon." Amon was quite a distance away from Brando, but his voice could easily reach him. Brando knew that it was a communication spell. Brando cursed in his heart. If he was just a nobleman, would he appear in this place? He checked his injuries. The green light projected on his retina constantly refreshed the data, quantifying the damage. Brando took a look and found that it was less than 10% of his life force. But because he had used his blood to feed the golden tree, or perhaps it should be called a magical thorn, he had lost too much blood. His life force had turned yellow. In fact, Brando could feel weakness creeping up his limbs, and a heavy feeling seemed to be dragging him to the ground. I have to end this quickly. He shook his head and tried to stay awake. The situation was not good. Even though the ground was covered in thorns, Greysword Saint Mephistopheles did not have the upper hand against Endesha in the air. It was just that the Lord of Withering Weeds was in a hurry to leave the area, and Mephistopheles was able to hold his ground for the time being. Endesha should be aware of this, and if this situation continues, it will be disadvantageous for her. She will definitely find an opportunity to break the stalemate. Brendel analyzed in his mind as he stared at Amon, who was not far away. He knew that the tree herders were not benevolent people. Even if there was only a sliver of hope, they would fight to the death. The battle above him would end quickly, but he did not have the time to care about other things. Amon was right in front of him, and it seemed like he had planned this beforehand. Otherwise, he would not have pretended to be killed when he was hit by the petrification arrow. Brando believed that not only him, even Andesha thought that her companion was dead. But this guy is resurrecting now. Is it because he saw that Andesha's situation is not good? Or is it because of other reasons? Brando frowned. If it was the latter, it meant that Amon had some sort of confidence. It was like a schemer coming out from behind the scenes. Unless he was forced to do so, he must have the confidence to win. Even if he thought that he could win, it was still the same. Where did his confidence come from? These thoughts flashed through Brendel's mind for a moment. Then, he heard the sound of footsteps. Veronica was already beside him. The plaza was already in ruins from the previous attack. Veronica was also frowning. She knew Amon better than Brando. She did not like this cleric as he was too shrewd. But such a gloomy person would definitely not stand in front of the stage so casually. There seemed to be a thick smell of conspiracy in the air. Amon looked at the two of them with a smile, as if he had seen through their thoughts. You must be curious as to why I am here. But this is indeed surprising. Valhalla actually exists. No matter what, I have to thank you for helping me. He took out a book from his bosom as he spoke. The book was covered in black smoke, and it was obvious that it was not a good item. Or rather, it was more like an evil item. Amon, what are you talking about? Veronica frowned and asked. Veronica, you still don't understand. Valhalla has maintained the stability of the loop of trade winds for thousands of years. As long as we destroy that hidden flame, not to mention Erwin, even the crew's empire will be greatly affected. It is an honor to be able to destroy an empire with my own hands. Amon opened the book in his hand and said, not to mention, legend has it that Valhalla hides a secret about history. You and I are fortunate enough to witness it all. You are crazy. Veronica frowned. Although she did not like this cleric, she could not help but be shocked to hear him say such words. No, don't you always call us crazy. Amon shook his head and smiled sanctimoniously. In fact, we are all the same. The crew's empire has been killing for thousands of years to conquer. Compared to them, our actions are relatively more noble. You are simply twisting words and forcing logic. Veronica's sword-like eyebrows stood up. Her last words seemed to be dragged out as she charged straight at Amon. One person and one sword, like a hazy green light. However, Amon seemed to have expected this. He opened the book in his hand, and a black curtain of light suddenly appeared 100 feet away from him. Veronica's sword landed squarely on the curtain of light. Not only did it have no effect, but a strong light flashed on the curtain of light and almost knocked her sword out of her hand. The sword saint took a step back with difficulty and barely managed to regain control of Azure Firmament. However, the huge force on her arm forced her to kneel down and let out a muffled groan. It doesn't matter if you are twisting words and forcing logic. Veronica, if you have any last words, you can tell me. I will respect your choice. Amon held the book in one hand and looked down at the sword saint condescendingly. He said it so casually, as if the life and death of everyone present was in his hands. Andesha, who was fighting Mephisto in the air, became even more dissatisfied when she saw this scene. Her comrade clearly had the ability to deal with Mephisto easily, but he chose to feign death and put her in a difficult position. Even if she knew that their so-called cooperation was not worth mentioning, she still couldn't help but roar, "Hammer, why aren't you getting rid of those bastards? What are you waiting for?" However, Amon only raised his head and glanced at the sky as if he didn't care about Veronica at all. He then lowered his head and continued to speak to Veronica. So, what do you think of my suggestion? Veronica held her numb wrist and looked at Amon with a gloomy expression. She didn't expect this cleric to be hiding his strength all this time. At least from this spell, his strength wasn't inferior to Andesha's. The huge difference in strength made her heart turn cold. Andesha alone was enough to make them use all their strength to deal with her, and now there was another cleric. Veronica couldn't think of a way to win. But just as she lowered her head and thought of a way to turn the tables, Brando's voice suddenly rang out, "Don't listen to him. That's just the power of the book. The wall of chaos only has 3 chances of absolute defense. I bet that guy doesn't have the ability to cast it a second time." The young man's voice startled Veronica. Although she didn't dare to believe Brando's words, she saw Amon's expression as if he had seen a ghost when she looked up. However, the traitor of the Holy Cathedral of Fire wasn't in the mood to pursue this matter. When Brando said those words, he felt like his head had been hit by a meteor. Because Brando wasn't wrong at all. Although the Green Sword Saint was a woman, she had rich experience in the battlefield. She only needed to look at Amon's expression to know that Brando was telling the truth. At least, most of it was true. She immediately had a plan in her mind and rushed towards Brendel with her sword. When Amon reacted, it was already too late. He cursed under his breath, "Damn it." He grabbed the book in his hand and retreated. At the same time, he released 2 rays of black light from his hands in an attempt to stop Veronica's actions. Unfortunately, the gap between him and the Empire's goddess of war was too big. Veronica easily passed through the gap between the 2 rays of black light and slashed her sword at the black screen. The screen flashed, and Amon panicked as he tried to think of a way to block it again. But at this time, he saw Brando in the distance taking out a longbow from under his cloak. "Bastard!" Amon cursed. Brando's actions were always perfect. He even suspected that the 2 of them were longtime partners. But he didn't know that with Brando's current experience, he could easily work with anyone. The bowstring twanged, and the black screen disintegrated. Veronica immediately took the opportunity to charge forward, but she didn't expect Brando to stop her. "Careful, retreat. The Book of Mavicard is not that simple." The Sword Saint completely believed Brendel's words at this moment. She stopped abruptly, and in a moment, less than 5 feet in front of her was instantly annihilated by the collapse of the mana. The rocky surface was actually turned into fine powder under the huge pressure. If she had taken half a step forward before, she would have been crushed to pieces. After the terrifying tremor, the square was once again filled with smoke and dust. Veronica couldn't help but take a light breath and look back at Brando. "Be careful, he still has room to fight back." But Brando's voice continued to come from behind the smoke. He put down Halran Gaia, but his tone was not relaxed. "To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 459. The stone slabs on the plaza crumbled into rubble, leaving behind a thin layer of mist. For a moment, the battlefield became even more dangerous. The powerful magic energy tore the ground apart, forming a circle of deep trenches. When the wall of chaos was destroyed, it would release all the magic energy it absorbed. The power of Veronica's 3 full-powered attacks was imaginable. The dozens of crisscrossing and fragmenting cracks on the plaza were proof of that. Suddenly, the magic energy surged, and a terrifying aura came from behind the white mist. Brando and Veronica's hearts skipped a beat. Amon was indeed stalling for time when he was negotiating with Veronica. "Little guy, what the hell is that?" Veronica gasped. Even at her level, she felt suffocated by the fluctuation of magic energy. What kind of terrifying spell was that? Brando was even more uncomfortable. Although the Planeswalker's ability and various items gave him endless means to protect himself even in the face of elemental power, he could not help but feel like he was about to collapse. Mavi. The Book of Coulter. I didn't expect it to be here. Brando gritted his teeth. It's that book. Why is it here? Veronica's expression changed. The evil book Mavicart. Named after the abomination of demons, it was worshipped as a holy book by the believers of chaos. It was an ancient evil that was born in the sea of chaos. Legend has it that this book could devour everything in the world to obtain forbidden power. Although it was an evil book, it was almost as powerful as a divine artifact. But legend has it that this book had fallen in the Twilight War. How did it appear in Amon's hands? As they spoke, the magic energy between heaven and earth had gathered as if a black hole had appeared in the center of the plaza. Even the wind and fog were spiraling towards the center. But only for a moment, the magic energy suddenly expanded outward, and a circle of black light suddenly burst out. The light circle first swept over Brando and Veronica's heads, and with a whoosh, it swept across the entire ruins in an instant. A few screams could be heard from the side of the square. It seemed to be Vahina's voice. They retreated into the forest under Scarlet's protection, but the black halo caught up to them in an instant. Not only on the ground, even Andesha and Mephisto, who were fighting in the sky, could feel the vibrations coming from the ground. Andesha was able to gain the upper hand in her demonic dragon form, but she was not a true demonic dragon. Furthermore, Greysword Saint Mephistopheles was not stupid enough to face her head-on. He circled around her, not giving her any chance to escape from the demonic world's thorns. Andesha could feel her strength weakening as time passed, and she could no longer maintain her dragon form. However, there was nothing she could do about it. Her heart was burning with rage, and even her eyes were burning with black flames. But right at this moment, the two of them exclaimed softly at the same time and looked down at the square. The second ring of black light was spreading out. It's going to kill me. Dark shockwave. Brando cursed in his mind. It was a top-tier 11th circle curse. On the surface, it was a spell that could bombard the ground, but it was known as the limit of a human. None of the 11th circle curses were simple. The first component of this spell was the sky ceiling curse. Andesha and Mephisto, who were in midair, immediately felt their bodies tighten, and the element energy that allowed them to hover in the air disappeared. Even the flapping of their wings did not give them the slightest bit of lift, and the two of them immediately fell from the sky. This is an indiscriminate attack. Andesha's face turned green, and she screamed, "Hammer, you're crazy." Of course, Amon was not crazy. A strange laughter came from the fog. "Andesha, I'm doing this to thank you for buying time for me, so that I can prepare the power of this sacred artifact. But it's a pity that you barbarians will never understand the majesty of supreme power." It was as if victory was within his grasp, and he was full of confidence. However, he did not relax his hands at all. The speed at which the magic power was gathering behind the fog actually increased. The third black light will immediately burst out, and this time, its power was even more shocking. The black trail was like a whip that swept across half of the square, and even the air was crackling as it exploded. Veronica held her breath as the wind blew her green hair in front of her forehead. She turned around and said, "Mavical's grimoire has the power of a god. We are not his match, we have to think of a way to retreat." "It's too late." Brando gritted his teeth and said, "If we run, we're dead. If we counterattack, we still have a chance." "How do we counterattack?" Although Mavical's grimoire is related to the supreme power of chaos, it is still inferior to the Twilight Dragon, especially when the caster is just a mortal like Amon. "We still have a chance," Brando calmly explained. "How do you know?" Veronica's emerald eyes looked at Brando curiously. "Amon was using words to buy time, and I'm sure you've noticed it. That's why I'm guessing that there's a gap between the casting of the grimoire." "Is that so?" Veronica still had some doubts, but Brando said, "In any case, there's no time to explain. Our only chance is to seize this opportunity. Time was indeed hanging by a thread. But little one, how are we going to block this spell? The fallen bishop's chanting could no longer be stopped. The mana was surging, and the intensity of the mana was enough to make one's scalp numb. No one thought that they could escape from such power. But Brando did not answer. He just quietly glanced in a certain direction. In that direction, Andesha was screaming as she fell from the sky. Veronica immediately reacted. "Little one, you can't be thinking of." It was at this time that the fourth black light flashed and interrupted her words. Another light will swept past the two of them. The clouds in the sky suddenly separated to the left and right. Behind the clouds, circles of black cog-like magic circles formed by lines appeared. The huge magic circle flashed slightly, and the runes representing Peruz, Ka, and Tiamat, which represented darkness and destruction, lit up one by one. The lines inside and outside the circle rotated in opposite directions, and then the center lit up, and an extremely thin line fell from there. It was a black line. It hit Amon, who was in the fog, and an overwhelming power rushed towards them. Everyone present could not help but feel a trace of throbbing in the depths of their hearts. "It's coming." Brando immediately bit his tongue. The sharp pain was like a sharp awl piercing his brain, making him quiver. Using this moment of clarity, Brando broke free from the terrifying pressure. "Let's go." He immediately retreated. At this time, Andesha had just crashed into the ground, and Brando took the opportunity to circle behind her. He wanted to let the Lord of the Tree Herders take the first hit for them. "You two bastards!" Andesha screamed angrily in the air, but she immediately crashed into the ground with a loud bang. Andesha, who was in her dragon form, was dizzy from the impact. She clenched her teeth and pushed away the layers of rocks on her body. She crawled up and was about to attack, but when she raised her head, Amon's magic was already on her. The tree shepherd's leader's deep purple eyes reflected a black pillar of light that shone like obsidian, descending from the sky. The pillar of light suddenly became 10 times thicker. Andesha sucked in a breath of cold air. The pillar of light was like a water column that hung from the clouds. The moment it touched the ground, the black light immediately scattered like ripples of water, spreading in all directions. But it was not a ripple of water. It was the power of darkness that brought destruction. "Ha, me, er." Andesha's anger reached its limit. She roared as if she wanted to cut Amon into pieces, but the black light that was tens of meters tall was already rushing towards her like a tsunami. She could only spread her wings and create a semicircular barrier of light in her dragon form. Asterisk boom. Asterisk the black light collided with Andesha, and she immediately let out a shrill scream. The barrier of light trembled violently, and cracks appeared all over it. Everything that the black light passed through was turned into ashes. The entire plaza was already broken and uneven due to the previous battle, but the black light was like a comb that sifted through all the rocks, leaving only a thin layer of flat earth behind. "Ah!" Andesha's eyes widened in shock and unwillingness. If she was at her peak, she might have been able to resist this spell. But with the hell's thorns cutting off her connection with the power of nature, even if it was the corrupted power of nature, her strength was less than half of what it was before. The black light surged forward, and the entire barrier of light was almost deformed. Andesha's dragon scales began to bleed, and the scales stood up and broke off. Blood splattered everywhere, and Andesha's screams turned into screams of agony. "Ah! Hammer, I curse you!" With this hateful roar, this giant dragon was actually pulled up from the ground by the copious amount of power and sent flying far away, crashing into the forest in the distance without making a sound. Brendel's eyes lit up. Andesha was around level 90 in this era, and it would take a lot of energy for the dark shockwave to completely destroy her. It would be like an arrow at the end of its flight if it tried to close in on him and Veronica. Now's the time. he said. Veronica understood and activated the magic equipment on her body. For someone of her level, she would more or less have some powerful protective equipment on her body. A pale green light shield was erected. Brando calmly took out his shale longbow. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 460. Among the 6 elements, light and darkness were the most special. The element of light was gentle and peaceful. It had the power to nourish life, but it could also cause harm to all negative energy. It was called purification. Warlocks who could control the element of light were called priests. In Wond, priests only practiced holy words and light spells. On the other hand, the dark element was the exact opposite. The dark element was extremely corrosive. It only attacked living beings, but in turn, it could strengthen negative creatures like the undead and demons. Wond player's handbook. The silver cover of Mavecart's grimoire glowed with an indescribable gloomy light. Amon's palms were devoid of vitality as he placed them on the pages. His fingers were shriveled, and he quickly aged. However, he did not seem to notice it as he laughed maniacally. Andesha, Veronica, you're just like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. Ha ha ha. What a joke, what a joke. However, he soon couldn't laugh anymore. The laughter stopped abruptly. Amon looked at the arrow that pierced through the layers of black light and headed straight for him like a meteor from outer space. This is impossible. His arrogant laughter turned into a sharp cry. He wanted to pull away, but he was firmly stuck to the page. With a muffled sound, the wolf fang arrow pierced through his chest. Ah! Ah! He's actually still alive. Brando was equally shocked. He had no experience dealing with the Book of Mavicart. It was said that this book had always been in the Creation Temple, and had never been touched by anyone before the War of the Slate Slabs. However, Brando was very familiar with the spell, Dark Shockwave. Based on Wond's basic rules, the dark element would only affect living creatures, or in other words, it would burn and erode the life force itself. Therefore, he was not surprised that his arrow could penetrate the waves and hit the target. The arrow itself was a lifeless object. But Amon didn't die. Martha above, he was a weak priestess. Moreover, this was already the second arrow. If this happened in the game, Brando would probably think that he had encountered some kind of bug. In fact, he was already thinking that he had encountered some kind of bug. Not only did Amon not die, but he also pressed on the wound with one hand and screamed in horror, "Ah, ah, ah, my magic, ah. The Book of Mavicart, oh, you're all dead." As soon as he finished speaking, the layers of black shockwaves in the square began to tremble. With a boom, they exploded into countless dark specks of light that scattered in all directions. The square fell silent all of a sudden, leaving only a faint layer of twilight clouds. The clouds made the air carry a fishy smell. The spell was disrupted. The mist dispersed little by little, leaving Amon standing behind, panting heavily. He was taller than the average Cruz, so he looked more like a thin shadow. Amon's face was pale, and his mouth was full of blood. He stared at Brando with eyes full of hatred, as if his parents had died. It almost made Brando wonder if he owed him hundreds of thousands of tor. But he quickly came to his senses. Veronica could not help but open her mouth slightly. They saw a hole in the silver-black cover of the Book of Mavicart in Amon's hand. Brando stared at the hole in shock. He actually punched a hole in the book. Brendel almost rubbed his eyes in disbelief. Mother Marcia above, that was an ancient evil artifact, an existence equivalent to a demigod artifact. How did he manage to make a hole in it? Amon's lips trembled, and it took him some effort to squeeze out a sentence. "You are all dead." His voice was almost distorted due to anger. At this time, Brando suddenly reacted. He immediately exclaimed in surprise. "I got it, the Book of Mavacart is a fake." Amon and Veronica's expressions changed at the same time, but the difference was that one was frightened, and the other was confused. "A fake?" "No, it should be a projection of the original. It's just a record of the power of the ancient evil item." "It's a fake," Brando immediately explained to Veronica. "Although it has the same level of power, it doesn't have as strong a defense as the ancient evil item." "Enough!" Amon hurriedly screamed and interrupted Brando. Although his sweat glands had almost degenerated after becoming an undead, he still could not help but feel cold sweat dripping down his face. Amon never dreamed that there would be a sacred item that was so familiar with all for one here. And this person was neither Veronica nor Greysword Saint Mephistopheles, but an unknown young man. The Book of Mavacart had not appeared for nearly 10,000 years. Although it's just a projection, its power is enough to destroy you insects. Amon's expression was uncertain. "As long as I cast another spell." "Oh," Veronica finally understood. She looked back at Amon, her emerald eyes full of a dangerous glint. The crew's goddess of war sneered. "Do you think I'll give you a chance to cast a spell, Amon?" Veronica attacked at the same time. She was no match for Andesha at her peak, and she could not suppress the power of the Book of Mavacart. But whether it was the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders or the sacred item from prehistoric records, they were all existences above mortals. Andesha was said to have experienced the war of the holy saints and was a monster that had lived for thousands of years. The Book of Mavacart was an evil item born in the Sea of Chaos. But even so, Veronica was still a genius among mortals, the goddess of war of the crew's race. She had achieved so much in less than 150 years of age. Her sword was full of the amazing talent of the human race. It was full of pride and arrogance. The sword was like a full moon, and the sky blue sword was like a verdant sword. Amon's face turned pale. "Oh, no." His pale face was distorted. His eyes were filled with unwillingness, regret, and madness. His hands were like the claws of a bird as he hugged the Book of Mavacart tightly. He did not want to let go, as if hugging the book could save his life. He screamed, "No, you bastards. I won't let you have it easy. Even if I die." Amon growled like a wild beast. His withered fingers clasped tightly on the silver-black title page. Suddenly, a dazzling black light shot out. The black light expanded and formed an area where even light could not escape. It was pure black without any impurities. It was as if it wanted to suck in people's minds. Black hole of annihilation. Brando was alarmed. The Book of Mavacart was said to have the ability to devour everything and turn it into its own power. But this was too exaggerated. It was as if there was an invisible gravitational force between heaven and earth, gathering everything to one point. He looked down and was shocked to see a layer of light floating on the Halran Gaia in his hand. But when he took a closer look, it was not a layer of light, but a layer of translucent lines. These complex lines were the magic circles engraved on the sword. The powerful gravitational force generated by the Book of Mavacart pulled these things out of the Halran Gaia. Brando could not help but curse in his heart. The Book of Mavacart was absorbing the power of the law. This was too scary. Once these magic circles were broken down, the Halran Gaia would be no different from a blank longsword. At most, it would be slightly longer and wider, like a heavy sword. However, when the black hole appeared, the first one to suffer was Amon. He obviously did not have the ability to control this spell. With a sharp scream, his whole body was pulled into the black hole. Then came the closer. Veronica could no longer retract her sword. The azure firmament trembled and flickered for a moment or two. The dark green blade dimmed and turned into an ordinary weapon. The azure firmament was a wind elemental holy sword. It was a fantasy weapon like the Halran Gaia, but it was completely destroyed in a moment. For a moment, Brando and Veronica's expressions changed. The power of the Book of Mavacart is to devour everything. Destroy the projection of the book. Brando shouted immediately. Veronica, of course, was aware of this. She sent out several green sword auras, but unfortunately, the wind elemental sword auras collapsed as they approached the edge of the black hole. Moreover, the black hole absorbed the sword auras and expanded. The huge suction force made Brando feel that he could not stand still. Get out of the way. A hoarse voice interrupted coldly. Trash. Andesha's voice came from the direction of the forest. The patriarch of the tree herders was still alive. She struggled to walk out of the forest, her body covered in wounds and blood. Even the tree bark that covered her body was cracked. Her ample bosom stood proudly in the air. But Andesha was not a human, and she did not care. Instead, she raised her hand and sent a green light towards the black hole. No, wait. Brando's expression changed. He wanted to stop her, but it was too late. The green light disappeared as soon as it entered the black hole. Andesha immediately screamed, "How is this possible? This thing is devouring the power of elements. Ah, what the hell is this?" She looked as if she had seen a ghost, but Brando could not help but curse in his heart. Even though the power of elements was the highest law in Wond, there were still differences between the different elements. If he remembered correctly, the Book of Mavacart represented the purest form of chaos. It could devour and contain everything. A mere secondary time could not affect its laws in the slightest. Brando was depressed because the black hole had expanded even further after absorbing Andesha's power. This time, even Veronica could not withstand the force of the black hole, let alone him. He was sent flying towards the center of the black hole. Fuck. That brainless woman. Seeing this scene, he almost fainted from anger. But of course, Brendel would not accept his fate, or rather, it was as if he had expected this. At the last moment, he gritted his teeth and raised Halran Gaia with both hands, and stabbed it into the black hole. Ah! Brando! Brother Brando! My lord! After the black hole was formed, the fog in the square was swept away like a tornado. Scarlet and the others saw this scene from afar. Brendel flew into the air, his whole body turned into a sword and pierced into the center of the darkness. The Halran Gaia's blade emitted a bright white light, as if it was under great pressure. The girls could not help but let out a cry of surprise. However, it was at this moment that a crisp sound like glass shattering resounded in the square. Under everyone's gaze, the first to shatter was actually the Annihilation black hole. Everyone was stunned. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 461. Impossible. Andesha couldn't help but scream. But nothing was impossible. She didn't know that the Halran Gaia had such an attribute, indestructible. This attribute didn't come from the sword itself, or rather, it came from the moment Brando held it in his hand. It came from the stability of Brando's element. The power of the Annihilation black hole seemed invincible, and even Andesha herself couldn't move it at all. But at the end of the day, it was because her elemental energy was too low. Brando remembered that when Veronica's azure firmament was destroyed, his Halran Gaia was able to resist the corrosion of the chaos power. It wasn't because of the distance between them. Thus, he placed his hopes on the sword in his hand, or rather, his element power. A few seconds ago, when the Annihilation black hole sucked Brando in with an irresistible force, He aimed at the ancient book floating in the middle of the black hole and slashed down with his sword. And then there was a cracked sound. Just like that, the annihilation black hole shattered before everyone's eyes like glass shattering. I actually succeeded. Brendel was dumbfounded. He fell from the sky and felt a burst of joy in his heart. But suddenly, he felt the same throbbing in his heart. Mavecart's grimoire represented the power of chaos. Even though the one in front of him was a fake, the level of power was still there. If his sword could split it in half, wouldn't it mean that his elemental power was at least at the level of 4 elements? The 4 elements, Flame King Gretel, Wind Empress Saint Tassol, High Priest Jianzhen, and Saint Eloranta, were just a so-so. To be able to stand on the same level as these legendary names was definitely something that Brando didn't even dare to think about in the game. That was the privilege of RMB players and face fighters, but now it seemed like it was possible. But it was a pity that it was still one step away from the power of chaos. Brando was a little greedy, but this greed only lasted for a moment. At this moment, he wanted to shout out loud to express his excitement. This wasn't just because he confirmed that his element power was on par with the 4 saints, but also because the last obstacle was finally cleared. Valhalla was right in front of him. He didn't know how the lucky player in the game obtained this territory, but at least for him, it was indeed a narrow escape. First, he offended Cruz's people. Then, he went through the demonic wave, Calamity of Wolves, Greysword Saint Mephistopheles, Ekis Nightmare, and finally, he had to escape from one of the 12 tree herders, Andesh's. Difficulty, this. Brando couldn't help but whisper. Of course, he had never completed any SSS before. He stood in the middle of a pile of rubble and turned his head, his gaze landing on Andesha. At this moment, the Lord of the Tree Herders no longer had her previous arrogance. Facing Brando's dangerous gaze, Andesha gritted her teeth and immediately said, I admit defeat. She was very straightforward because she knew that she wasn't a match for Veronica and Mephistopheles. Moreover, in her eyes, Brando wasn't simple either. He had countless tricks up his sleeves and could even destroy the annihilation black hole. In truth, she was more afraid of Brando. Lady Veronica, can you keep an eye on this person? Brando didn't intend to force Andesha into a dead end. Even a rabbit would bite when cornered, not to mention that the Lord of Withering Flowers was an injured lion. The goddess of war of the Cruz Empire looked at the sword in her hand with pity. The once dazzling wind holy sword looked like an ordinary metal now. She sighed and nodded. There was no trace of the Lionheart sword in the loop of trade winds, which meant that the Cruz Empire's efforts were in vain. They even lost the Azure Firmament, which was also a fantasy-grade holy sword. Even Veronica couldn't help but feel dejected. Rockwell is still a guest in the Empire's prison. You can accompany him, Andesha. Veronica said to Andesha as she sheathed her sword. Andesha didn't say a word and only snorted coldly. Brando cursed in his heart. Rockwell was one of the 12 tree herders' patriarchs, the Lord of Tainted Blood. No one had ever seen him in the game. The players thought that he was the big boss behind the scenes, but they didn't expect him to be locked up in the Cruz Empire's prison. The truth was a little awkward. But if Andesha moved in, the Kurlutz Empire would be holding 2 leaders of the Tree Shepherds captive, and the enmity between them would be too great. But Brando was more than happy to see the Cruz Empire and the Tree Herders go head-to-head. Faina finally noticed that the battle at the plaza had ended. She hurriedly ran over with Scarlet not far behind her. The red-haired girl with a ponytail was still a little quiet. She held Sifrid's hand and slowly walked over. The bad-tempered little princess of the Cruz Empire came to Veronica's side. She didn't dare to cross the line and obediently greeted her, Commander. But Veronica could only shake her head and sigh when she saw the troublesome little princess. Veronica knew that Faina wasn't a bad person, but which noble descendant of the Empire wasn't this arrogant and condescending? The Empire gave them glory, and they used the same pride to protect the Empire's prestige. If they didn't have this kind of pride, how could they have the pride of an eagle? But, the crew's Empire's goddess of war shook her head and glanced at Brando, who was not far away. Scarlet also silently watched Brando comforting Sifrid without saying a word. "What's wrong?" Brando noticed the girl's stubborn expression and felt a little strange. "It's nothing, my lord," Scarlet replied. She didn't want Brando to see her weakness. Previously, she had no leeway to intervene and could only watch helplessly as her liege fought to protect her. That feeling of complete weakness had completely shattered the perseverance in her heart. Therefore, if she didn't show her stubbornness on her face, she could only show her weak side. She didn't want to be a weak girl in front of her lord. "Since it's about time, let's go up and take a look, little one," Veronica suddenly said. She raised her head and looked at the towering world tree. Even though the chances of finding the Lionheart sword were slim, the crew's Empire's goddess of war was still curious about the secrets of the legendary world tree. Not to mention that there was a legendary ancient flame seed in the world tree. In the present-day wound, no one had ever seen the blessing of Martha. It was a seed of order that was left in the world before the gods existed. These seeds had long since turned into huge guardian lands. Veronica wasn't the only one who was slightly moved. Even the Ash Sword Saint was slightly moved when he learned of this secret. This meant that after thousands of years, the civilized world would once again expand its territory. The significance of this was too great. And Desha was the only one who was gnashing her teeth in anger. When Mephisto heard the news, he seemed to be slightly relieved. But I have a strange feeling that Mephisto's face is slightly relieved. He was a little confused. What was with this kind of expression? Brando couldn't help but look at Mephistopheles and Veronica suspiciously. In theory, the Ash Sword Saint and the crew's Empire's goddess of war were irreconcilable enemies. He almost forgot about it because of the intense battle earlier. But now that he thought about it, how did the two of them end up together? Not only that, but they even fought side by side against Endesha. If this news was spread in the game, 9 out of 10 people wouldn't believe it, and the remaining one would think that he was crazy. But Brando suddenly thought of something and turned to Veronica. "Esteemed Lady Veronica, can you explain to me about that guy? Why can't he stand on our side?" Veronica pretended to be puzzled and smiled. "Count Mephistopheles is a reasonable person, little one. When facing a common enemy like the tree herders, it's normal for us to stand together." The Ash Sword Saint was a reasonable person? Would a reasonable person chase him and Scarlet all over the mountains and plains without saying a word? Brando didn't believe in this kind of reason at all. He couldn't help but look at Veronica suspiciously, and some bad thoughts started to form in his mind. Could it be that this old hag is using some underhanded methods, such as the legendary honey trap? The more Brando thought about it, the more likely it seemed. After all, even though Veronica was over 100 years old, this age was nothing to someone of her strength. At least on the surface, Veronica could be considered a woman of unparalleled beauty. Even though she rarely pretended to anyone, Brando thought that if she really wanted to, Mephistopheles would fall for her trap. Isn't this how most melodramatic storylines are arranged? What national enmity and personal feelings are intertwined together? Brando suddenly felt that this was simply impossible, and the evidence was irrefutable. But at this moment, he heard Veronica snort coldly in his ear. "Little one, what kind of evil thoughts are you having?" The crew's goddess of war stared at him from the corner of her eyes. "Me? I'm not." Brando immediately shook his head like a rattledrum. Thinking about it was one thing, but if he really said it out loud, whether it was true or not, this woman would probably stab him in the heart first. But Veronica was so experienced that she could see through Brando's lies at a glance. She could even guess what dirty thoughts were in Brando's mind. She couldn't help but grit her teeth and said, I just made a promise to Count Mephistopheles. As expected. Brando couldn't help but blurt out, this is the so-called promise to marry someone. As expected, my ass. Veronica's veins were bulging even though she was a noble lady. She knocked Brando's head with the hilt of her sword. I just promised to help him restore his kingdom. Wait, restore his kingdom. Brendel blocked the goddess of war's sword with both hands and almost bit his tongue off. Did I hear wrongly? You want to help her restore her kingdom? He looked at Veronica in disbelief. Are you joking? The Cruz Empire will agree to such a thing. Impossible, those bastards are so arrogant that they almost think that the whole of Wone should listen to their orders. Unless pigs grow wings and fly to the trees, they will spit out the meat in their mouth. No, Brendel shook his head firmly. Even if pigs grow wings and fly to the trees, the Kurlutz people will not bow their heads. Lady Veronica, you're not lying to the honest brother Ash Sword Saint, are you? If he gets angry later, we won't be able to handle it. Don't forget that Endesha is still here. The news was too shocking, and even Brendel almost could not hold it in for a moment. He felt that unless Veronica was the Empress, no, even if she was the Empress, she would never make such a decision. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 462. Veronica looked at Brando helplessly. She found that the young man's impression of Cruz was very bad. Of course, this was because of the hatred between the two countries. Although the hostility between the common people did not prevent her from appreciating the young man from a higher level, she did not know whether to laugh or cry at Brando's hostility towards the Empire. She did not understand how a smart person like Brando could be blinded by the hatred of hundreds of years ago. His vision should be far beyond the lowest level of the Empire and Erewhon. Of course, Veronica did not understand that Brando was so hostile towards the Cruz Empire because of what will happen in the future. Even if he said this reason out loud, the goddess of war of the Empire would probably treat it as the ravings of a lunatic. Brando coughed and remembered that there was an imperial general standing beside him. Veronica's smile made his hair stand on end, so he quickly changed the topic. Actually, I want to say, Lady Veronica, you want to help the Sword Saint of Ashes to restore the Empire, but it seems that it is not that easy. You should know this better than I do, Lady Veronica. Brendel chose his words carefully. The Empire is controlled by the Parliament of Nobles, so even if you have the support of the Emperor, you will still be opposed by the other nobles. Furthermore, the enmity between the Ash Sword Saint and the Kurlutz Empire is no longer just a matter of territory. You should know how many of the Imperial Academy's young cadets were killed during the incident in the Imperial capital. Those young elites are an incalculable loss to the Empire today. I heard that the Empire has even set a bounty of tens of millions on Mr. Mephisto's head. That's not a small sum of money. You seem to be very familiar with the Empire's affairs. Oh, no. I am just a suso. Brando quickly humbled himself. He wanted to let the goddess of war of the Empire know that he was not joking. Humph. This guy is especially looking for trouble with the Empire. Although I don't know why he has such a deep grudge, I think it is enough to motivate him to study the history of the Empire. At this time, Vahina, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly interjected and rolled her eyes at him. Brando was a little surprised. Vahina's words sounded like she was mocking him, but in fact, she was trying to excuse him. He could not help but feel a chill down his spine. This lady actually has good intentions. There must be a conspiracy. But Veronica seemed to accept this explanation. She nodded. You are right. This proposal will not pass the Empire. You really lied to him. Even someone like the Sword Saint of Ashes, who no one would dare to offend, he dares to lie to me. As expected of a politician. As expected of a thick-skinned and black-hearted person. Can't you think of something better? Why are all the youngsters nowadays so evil? I'm the Empire's Legion commander, so why would I lie? Veronica glared at him. Of course I'm telling the truth. But didn't you say? I said I can't, but that doesn't mean you can't. Veronica interrupted him. Me? Wait a minute. Brando suddenly understood what Veronica wanted to do. Why should I help him restore his empire? Restoring his empire is not an easy task. Also, this is a deal between the two of you, how can you drag me into it? He could not help but grumble. Why would I? The goddess of war of the Kurlots looked at him slowly. Little one, I can just leave. But I took the risk to persuade him to help you deal with Endesha. Don't you think you owe me a favor? Brando immediately shook his head like a rattledrum. Centuries ago, the Empire also owed Erwin a lot. So let's just call it an eye for an eye. We are even. Veronica did not know whether to laugh or cry. This brat was acting shamelessly. How could this be even? She could not help but poke his forehead. It's not that simple. Besides, this matter is not entirely a bad thing for you. I think you should understand this point. Why are you acting coquettishly with me? I'm sorry, I don't understand. Brando replied with a straight face. Veronica could not help but smile. It's okay, I'll explain it to you. You said that you wanted to help the druids ignite the fire seed. I think you also want this territory, right? Brando did not answer, but she did not care. She continued, you should already have the qualifications to become a knight. The moment the fire seed is ignited in your hands, you will legally have the right to own this land. It's a good plan, but it's not realistic. In the past, no one dared to spy on the loop of trade winds because no one knew that there was a primitive fire seed in the loop of trade winds. It represents a vast territory for growth. It's almost comparable to rebuilding Erwin. This temptation is too great, and no noble in your country can resist it. Those people do not care about whether it's legal or not. You should know very well, little one. Legal is just a name on the table. A primitive fire seed is enough to make anyone fall out with you. What about you? Brando looked at her with some vigilance. She was right. If this woman suddenly attacked him with a sword, he would not be able to withstand it. Me? Veronica was a little amused. Why would the Empire want an enclave? But if this territory is next to Cruz, maybe I'll be tempted. Brando nodded. In fact, when he thought about it deeply, his plan did have some loopholes. He was used to the way of thinking in the game. He was used to thinking that after obtaining the territory through legal means approved by the system, the only thing left to guard against was probably the players, except for the monsters. But here, those greedy nobles were also players. He felt that he seemed to have thought too much of the situation. First of all, he had a natural sense of closeness to the future Princess Royal because of his past history. But he forgot that in this place, he was just a passerby of the interest group. In the face of a territory that could grow to be comparable to Erwin in the future, even if the princess was wise, what would she think and let him rule this land? Don't forget, compared to Princess Griffin, he was just a stranger. Brando could bet on the Princess Regent's trust, but he could not afford to do so. This was not only about his future. So when Veronica opened her mouth, Brando actually understood the idea of the war goddess Cruz. She hoped that he could restore the old country of the Ash Sword Saint in this vast territory. This was indeed good for him. First of all, their interests were tied together. The Ash Sword Saint would not sit back and watch his plan to restore the country be spied on by other nobles in Erwin. However, to use nearly 1/3 of the territory in exchange for a talisman, this price was a little too painful. And what made him very unreconciled was that Veronica had taken care of a mortal enemy of the Empire without the Kurlutzians paying a single price. He was the one who was cutting his own flesh, and that woman was the one who reaped the benefits. For a moment, he suddenly felt that this smiling woman was an eyesore. She said that she was a dignified commander, but in the end, she was just as black-bellied. It's not that easy. Brando thought to himself and shook his head. It's far from enough. You know that compared to the nobles in Erewhon, my influence is far from enough. How can you guarantee that the Ash Sword Saint will be tied to my ship? He could have a better choice. Count Mephistopheles is not that kind of person. I'm not that kind of person either. Commander, do you believe me? Brando gritted his teeth and said. Veronica laughed. You're so smart, little guy. Well, I promise you. As the commander of the Azure Skies, I promise you that I will secretly support you in establishing this territory. With the Empire as your backing, Mephistopheles will not think too much. Brando nodded. This was the result he wanted. Although he dared to guarantee that Cruz would not give him any practical help, as long as he had such a promise, even if the princess wanted to find someone to replace him, she would have to weigh the chips carefully. As for whether Cruz would be able to fulfill this empty promise, there was no need to worry about that. Brando believed in Veronica's ability as a commander. Besides, if he was unlucky and caused Mephistopheles' plan to fail, it would not benefit her at all. But restoring a country is not that simple. Just having land is far from enough. I don't think Count Mephistopheles only wants to be a lord, right? Brando asked again. Of course, there are still some remnants of the original duchy in Kurlutz, and the people of the old country are still living in the original land. As long as these people are willing, I will find a way to arrange for them to be sent over. Veronica nodded and replied. Brando also nodded. Opening up the wilderness was not a simple matter. The guarded ground wasn't something that could be built overnight. It would require years of maintenance before it could reach its limit. It would already be considered fortunate if the fire seed was able to obtain at most 1/10 of the territory the moment it was ignited. To put it bluntly, Mephisto's clansmen were here to help him open up the dark forest. As for the original population of the forest, the Druids, after the calamity of wolves, the population of the Druids in the forest decreased by more than 80%. The remaining ones were mostly the elderly and children. For the time being, they could only focus on recuperating. To put it bluntly, he still had to rely on himself to migrate people from the outside. Therefore, he could not be calculative. After all, even the cleverest housewife could not cook without rice. After confirming all the conditions that Veronica could offer, Brando suddenly asked, Lady Veronica, you are doing all these for the Empire, but no one knows about it. On the contrary, if you arrange for Mephistopheles' people to escape from the Empire, no one will understand. Although I know that you are wholeheartedly doing this for the Empire, it will only be a weakness to your political enemies. Are you willing to do this? Veronica looked at him in annoyance. Stop trying to sow discord, little guy. You're still too inexperienced. I am a citizen of the Empire. Everything that I do for the Empire is of my own free will. The Empire's growing strength is the best reward for me. Besides, she squinted her eyes seductively, even if you succeed in sowing discord between me and the Empire, will you get any benefits from it? Even if I want to change my allegiance, little one, you are still not worthy of my loyalty. She suddenly felt a little amused and added, you are the one who should be loyal to me. Hee. Brando did not mind this level of sarcasm, then it is a pleasure to work with you. Since we have confirmed the ownership of this place, let us split up and search this area. This way, we will find it faster. I believe that the Druids outside will not be able to resist for long. You are really thick-skinned, Veronica could not help but shake her head. What did he mean by, since we have confirmed the ownership of this place? How thick-skinned must he be to say something like that? But the more confident this young man was, the more she liked him. She smiled and nodded, seems like you are going somewhere by yourself. Of course, Brando did not shy away from the topic. It was not easy to win. I still have to check my spoils of war. He used a tone that belonged to a player and answered matter-of-factly. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 463. Alright then, little one. Veronica looked at Brando with her emerald eyes. She had obtained the answer she wanted from Brando, so she was not as direct as before. Then I'll go to the west to take a look. Of course, if I find anything, I'll inform you first. She said with a smile. Brando pursed his lips. He did not know why, but Veronica seemed to have an inexplicable tolerance for him. She liked to tease him when she had nothing to do. But putting aside Cruz's identity, the goddess of war's way of doing things was enough to make him admire her. Besides, maintaining a personal relationship with a countess of the empire was not a bad thing for him. It was just that the two of them were destined to plot against each other on the level of the empire. As long as there are enough mutual benefits, it's enough for now. Brando needed a breather to grow stronger, and this agreement with Veronica might be able to help him achieve that. Thus, both of them obtained the most satisfactory results, and their cooperation was quite pleasant. At this time, the Empire's Legion commander had already left the plaza with the little princess of the flower domain. Before she left, Brando saw her stopping beside Mephisto. He did not know what she said, but the famous Ash Sword Saint turned around to look at him. Andesha was naturally taken away, and only the few of them were left in the plaza. Sifrid had been quietly holding on to his hand since the beginning. She had always been a calm and steady person. Brando knelt down to help her wipe the dust off her face. He looked at the little girl who had a head of long, vine-like hair that reached her ankles. He suddenly felt a little worried that she would grow up to be like Scarlet. Even though her lack of mouth was a cute trait, Brando was still worried about her mental state. He turned around to look at the red-haired girl, and his strange gaze made her feel a little strange. She silently lowered her head and frowned. Is my face dirty? Why would my lord keep looking at me like that? Does he want to help me wipe my face? She suddenly recalled the scene of Brando kneeling beside Sifrid and carefully cleaning her face. She could not help but feel a little restless. She did not know if she should accept or reject his request. But Brando only looked at her for a little while longer. Amon's corpse was still in the plaza, and that was the thing that he was interested in. Brando knew that a person like Amon would definitely have a lot of good things on him. At the very least, the equipment that allowed him to instantly cast high-grade defensive spells was priceless in the game. However, the chaos energy of the Annihilation Black Hole contained the law of annihilation. Even a piece of equipment like the Azure Firmament could not withstand it. But it was useless. There was one thing he regretting it, the chaos energy's law of Amons. But the law, of course, the black S's. And the chaos. God, annihilation, but it. The fragment of the Book of Mavicart. A fragment of a fake divine artifact would be considered a high-grade material in the game. The place where the Annihilation Black Hole had been destroyed was now a bottomless pit. Smoke curled up from the bottom of the pit, and the surroundings were silent. Brendel was not used to there being no players fighting for equipment after a boss fight. He slid to the bottom of the pit 3 steps at a time, and his eyes twitched. Amidst the black smoke at the bottom of the pit, there was a ball of black light floating in the air. Even though Brando had never seen a fragment of the Book of Mavicart before, he could recognize it at a glance. A divine artifact was far stronger than a normal equipment. Even if it was damaged, the threads of law that were attached to it would still remain. The ball of black light was a pure remnant of the law of chaos, entropy, and the law of dissociation. In fact, all fragments of high-grade equipment were the same. As soon as he got close, he could feel a strong aura. Brando did not know how to deal with this thing. In the game, he rarely had the chance to come into contact with such a high-grade item. Even though this thing was a material, the law of dissociation was quite difficult to deal with. As it did not have a physical body, there was no way to put it in the backpack, unless there was something like a dimensional bag. However, Brando had never seen anything with dimensional attributes since he transmigrated. He thought for a moment, and reached out his silver right hand that was wrapped in the grip of Bahamut, and grabbed the ball of black light. The grip of Bahamut was known as the blessing of the Dragon King, and it was also a product of inheriting the law of dissociation. As soon as he grabbed the thing, he could not help but raise his eyebrows slightly. This thing. Brando was suddenly stunned, and his heart was filled with ecstasy. He realized that the Book of Mavacart was purely a remnant of the law of order. After this thing was refined, it was actually the same thing as the magic that created monsters. To put it simply, he realized that he could directly convert this thing into EXP that he could use. Brando almost screamed, because compared to the Book of Mavacart's law of dissociation, monsters that were below gold grade were simply dregs. This thing was simply treated as a boss, and a boss that was close to the power of a demigod. The EXP of a boss that was over level 160. Moreover, this was not an era where monsters were everywhere 120 years after the Great Demonic Tide, and the world leader boss's levels were all above level 200. This was the year of the sword, when the War of the Black Rose had just broken out. In this era, even the demigod awakened elemental awakened Scarlet was considered a mini-boss. An old witch like Andesha, who was almost level 80 to level 90, was considered a world leader. Oh my god, Martha, am I dreaming? Brando suddenly felt like he had been hit by a huge pie in the sky. He had casually extracted 20 to 30,000 EXP, and the ball of black light did not even seem to have the mood to reduce its size. Brando roughly estimated that this thing was worth at least tens of millions of EXP. He could not help but curse in his heart. It seemed that he had never been so lucky since he transmigrated. Could this be the legendary saying that one who survives a great disaster is bound to have good fortune in the future? Of course, extracting EXP from this thing was not that easy, because the law of a divine artifact was very tight. Extracting power from it was equivalent to stripping the law from it. Brando felt resistance from the beginning of the extraction. Although this resistance would not affect much, it would still take some time to absorb all the EXP. He thought for a moment, and decided to find a way to keep this thing first. This was a rare treasure. Brando felt that even if he fell asleep with this thing in his arms, he would wake up with a smile. The EXP of a world leader in the middle of the demonic tide was all for himself. This was something that he did not even dare to think about. But if he wanted to keep this thing, then the problem was back to square one. Where was he going to get a multi-dimensional bag? Multi-dimensional bags were not rare in Woned, but they were not cheap either. The average person would definitely not be able to afford them, but people like Veronica and Mephisto would definitely have them. Brando thought for a moment, and decided to let the Ash Sword Saint bleed a little. Who asked him to help him restore his country? This could be considered as an early payment. He immediately climbed out of the pit and prepared to borrow a multi-dimensional bag from Mephisto. But at this moment, a familiar voice rang in his mind. Ha! This is a fragment of a divine artifact. How did you get it, little brother? It was the voice of Orthless. In fact, ever since he encountered the remnant of the dark dragon Odin's will, Brando felt that Orthless had been in a deep sleep. He almost thought that the dark dragon had done something in secret. After all, Orthless was a subordinate of the four sages, and both sides were mortal enemies. But he did not expect that she would wake up at this time. Orthless, where did you go? Brando immediately asked. He wanted to confirm if Orthless had sensed Odin's presence. Call me big sister, little fool. Of course I saw that guy. He should have sensed my presence too. Orthless snorted and replied softly in his mind. Brando could not help but grin. Then You accepted his inheritance, right? I know that too. Orthless's voice did not sound angry. Although wind elves had always been indifferent, Orthless's emotions were still very obvious. Brando could not tell that she was angry, but he knew that this big sister really did not mind. But he was a little puzzled. Logically speaking, the four sages and the dark dragon should be mortal enemies. Orthless gave her ring of the Wind Empress to him, which meant that she had chosen him as her successor. How could she not mind him accepting the dark dragon's inheritance? But Orthless seemed to have guessed Brando's doubts and replied, there is no right or wrong in power itself. The most important thing is the person who controls it. Don't tell me that big sister doesn't have that much heart. I have high hopes for you, otherwise I would not have given you the ring. Besides, I also want to know what kind of inheritance that guy has. It sounds like you admire that guy a lot. Yes, Orthless did not avoid the topic and said in a reminiscing tone, after all, he was our strongest opponent. Generally speaking, people who have reached his level of strength are bound to have charisma. But after all, we are not in the same camp, and we represent different ideals. As the saying goes, good and evil cannot coexist. But now that we are all dead, the hatred of the past has long disappeared. Now, all that is left is respect for the opponent. Hearing Orthless's answer, Brando could not help but be silent. If a person did not fight for personal hatred, but for faith, perhaps he was worthy of respect. But history was history, and it was not something that a bystander like him could easily understand. Because he was not in that era, perhaps he could not understand the ideas that belonged to that era. Then what happened to you before? He didn't do anything to you, right? Brando asked again. Orthless did not mind the actions of the dark dragon, but now he was worried about the situation of this big sister wind elf. After all, the existence of the dark dragon was famous in history for being unforgivable. The elven knight shook her head in his mind. No, it's just that he passed some information about the inheritance to me, and I didn't react for a while. Information about the inheritance. Brando thought to himself. What kind of inheritance did the dark dragon have to pass on to his enemy? Although it was said to be respect for the opponent, the enemy was still the enemy after all. Could it be that the consciousness of these two groups of people had really reached the legendary height of communism? No matter how he thought about it, it was too strange. But Orthless did not seem to want to talk about this issue in depth. She avoided the question and changed the topic. By the way, my dear little brother, that guy seems to have awakened some of the ancient bloodlines in your body. I feel that you can learn some of my swordsmanship now. What? Brando felt that a big piece of meat had fallen from the sky, and it made him dizzy. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 464. Really? Brando couldn't believe it. Of course. Orthless rolled her eyes at him. Then what can I learn? Brendel couldn't help but ask immediately. The era of the War of the Holy Saints was probably the era that Vaughn had the closest connection with the ancient times in the past 1 or 2,000 years. After that, many of the ancient swordsmanship and combat skills passed down on the earth were lost. High-level skills completely disappeared, and even mid-level skills became rare goods. And just 1,000 years ago, among the Wind Elves, soldiers in the second-tier legions like the Forest Guards also studied mid-level skills. That was an era when power was at its peak. In the game, such an era would only return to the real world after more than 100 years, when the tide of the Demon Moon reached its peak. Ancient skills would only return to the real world after they were excavated from the stone slabs buried in the ground. But now, Wond was still a barren land. Even the White Raven swordsmanship, which was inherited from the Wind Elves, could be considered a secret technique of the royal family. Orthless was a heroic spirit who had lived through that era. As the Knight of the Wind Empress and the owner of this ring, Brando couldn't imagine what kind of inheritance she had. But what was certain was that this royal sister, who had accumulated over 1,000 years of experience in swordsmanship, was definitely a treasure trove to him, a huge and dazzling treasure trove. In swordsmanship, if you can't use your heart as one, it will be difficult to reach a high level. Orthless looked at him seriously and said, "So although I know a lot of things, I only plan to teach you one. 9 Luminary Sword Art." What? Brando almost thought he heard wrong. 9 Luminary Sword Art. Orthless repeated. As if he was struck by lightning, Brando froze and stared at Orthless in shock. According to legend, the inheritance of the Wind Elves was split into 3 after the War of the Holy Saints. The Summer King, Quainar, inherited the Sword of the Sun, and together with his scorching Sun Knights, seized the throne of the Elven King. To this day, the descendants of the Knights were still the mainstream nobles of the Wind Elven Empire. Saint Tossel's Knight Guards, the Starsong Knights, held the Starsong Sword. However, this line of inheritance had long been lost in history. When the last knight died over 400 years ago, the Starsong Sword was completely buried under the long river of history. But other than the Star and Sun, the Moon Sword, which was once the strongest and inherited from Saint Tossel, seemed to have been forgotten. Even her original people disappeared after the war. It was like a story of the past that was covered in dust and spider webs. No one mentioned it after that. But, Orthless enunciated the words 9 Luminary Sword Art clearly. It indeed came from Saint Tossel's Moon Sword, known as the strongest sword art. It was also one of the 3 great sword arts of the War of the Holy Saints. It was also the origin of the national emblem of Saint Tossel, the Sacred Wind Empress. Brando was shocked. He originally thought that as the Knight of the Wind Empress, Orthless would be the inheritor of the Starsong Sword. However, he did not expect her to bring out the moon inheritance the moment she opened her mouth. The 9 Luminary Sword Art was a strike of 9 swords. When one person attacked, it was as if 9 people were fighting side by side. If the speed of the flash strike sword art was its own specialty, then the 9 Luminary Sword Art was the limit of area of effect attacks. Or to put it simply, it was the strongest AoE swordsmanship. Moreover, regardless of whether it was an intermediate or advanced swordsmanship, it was one of the 3 major swordsmanship that was on par with the Flame King Gretel's flash strike sword art and the Saint Eleranta's Roar of the Mountains and Earth. In terms of reputation and practical use, it was not wrong to say that it was a genuine swordsmanship. I can learn it. Of course. Now. Brendel was a little incoherent after being hit by a big pie. If you have time now, of course I can stop and teach you slowly. Orthless looked around, but I suggest you deal with things here first. After all, swordsmanship is not something that can be learned overnight. With Orthless's reminder, Brando came back to his senses. Indeed, swordsmanship could be learned at any time, but there were more important things at hand. The druids were still struggling to hold on, and he had to find the primordial flame seed in the loop of trade winds as soon as possible. And before that, he had to deal with the remnant laws of the Book of Mavacart. Otherwise, he would not be able to travel with such unstable energy. Speaking of which, Orthless looked at the black light in his hand. Little guy, this looks like a fragment of a divine artifact. How did you get it? It's just a fake. Brando answered truthfully. A fake is already very impressive. What do you plan to do with it? This is a pure law of order. You can absorb its power for your own use. This thing is a rare treasure for you. You have to think of a way to deal with it properly. A heroic spirit from the War of the Holy Saints was indeed a heroic spirit from the War of the Holy Saints. With Orthless's knowledge, she could actually see through the essence of this thing at a glance. Well, I have experience dealing with this kind of thing. I just have to find a dimensional item to store it in. Brando answered without blushing. Dimensional attribute, huh? That's a good idea. The stability of the law of space can freeze many high-level elements. Fragments of the law of space are not a problem. Orthless was talking to the young man when she suddenly stopped and looked to the side in surprise. What's wrong? Brando asked. Aren't you looking for a dimensional item? Orthless asked. Huh? Brando immediately looked in that direction, but Orthless could not see anything. Not to mention a dimensional bag, there was not even a small piece of rock in the vicinity. However, Brando knew that Orthless would not joke with him at this time. He carefully observed for a while, and his heart suddenly skipped a beat. Damn, no way. The surprise in his heart quickly turned into surprise, and then surprise turned into a pleasant surprise. It was the kind of surprise that one would get if they found some money on the side of the road. After repeated inspection, Brando found that there was a slightly shining silver line in the smoke. The silver line was so small that if Orthless did not remind him, he would not have noticed it. Of course, it was not a silver line at all. If Brando guessed correctly, it should be something he was very familiar with. He immediately walked over and carefully pressed his hand on the silver line, and then gently pulled it apart. The smoke around the silver line surged, and a hole appeared in front of him. It seemed to have no thickness at all from the side, but from the front, it looked like a cross-section. It was as if space had been cut open. Dimensional hole. This. He took a deep breath and raised his hand. There was a shiny object in his hand. This is. He took a deep breath and raised his hand. There was a shiny object in his hand. God-slaying magic breaking all. Orthless sucked in a breath of cold air. This thing was made from the wood of the golden tree and had a secret magic circle on it. It had the ability to suppress all elemental elements and magic power. Other than the power of existence, almost all elemental elements could be suppressed. Brando also knew that this thing had another name. It was called Pain in the Balls, because it could suppress all elements, magic, and supernatural abilities for a minute. It was the best weapon to use against people. However, this item was one of the few experimental products that Great Priest Farnazane had made in the later stages of his life in order to grasp the power of chaos. In this world, he was the only person who had grasped both the power of order and chaos at the same time, and the method of making it had long since been lost. Furthermore, it was a one-time consumable item, so the few items left behind were all priceless. Brando had seen people use it a few times when he was fighting world bosses in the game. As for using it against people, no one would be so extravagant as to use it against people. It could suppress elements and magic. It was like the world of Wond had one less nuclear weapon. However, you actually have a total of 7 of these nuclear weapons in this dimensional cave. 7. Brando took out the god-slaying magic-breaking alls one by one, and then took out a lot of transparent test tubes and bottles. These were all holy potions. There were hundreds of bottles of holy potions. Since holy potions were a product of the War of the Holy Saints, Orthless did not know the use of these things. However, when she learned from Brando that these potions could be used to directly restore life, this knowledgeable knight could not help but be amazed. After all, civilization was still developing. Although the magic of the demon moon had been declining since the end of the War of the Holy Saints, there was no lack of intelligent people among the later generations. They had invented many things that were not available before the War of the Holy Saints. For example, magic technology, airships, and so on. However, at this time, Brando's expression suddenly changed again. He stopped what he was doing, and then took out 2 bottles of potions from the dimensional hole. Orthless recognized that it should still be holy potions, but looking at Brando's expression, it did not seem like it. Of course, she did not know that Brando's heart was in turmoil at the moment. He took out Holy Potions number 1. Holy Potions number 1 were the original products of all Holy Potions. In order to develop a potion that could heal the wounded, the Holy Sanctum first produced this product. This thing was the crystallization of countless manpower and money, and its initial effect was beyond everyone's expectations. In terms of Holy Potions number 1 were definitely the best. But for a potion that was used on a large scale, it had a huge drawback: it was too expensive. Due to the lack of cost, the effect of Holy Potions number 1 had almost reached the realm of reviving the dead with just one drop, but the price was enough to make any force in the world shudder. It was precisely because of this reason that other types of Holy Potions after Holy Potions number 1 were gradually mass-produced. Of course, the effect was getting more and more diluted. The 2 bottles of Holy Potions Brando took out were no longer Holy Potions in his eyes, but glittering gold coins. No, it should be said that it was a dazzling mountain of gold. He placed these items in front of him one by one, and his eyes could not help but become a little sluggish as he took a deep breath. He then checked the items in the dimensional hole and found that it was not only Holy Potions, but also gold and silver coins. There were also large amounts of magic materials and some high-grade magic armors. They were all standard armors and weapons of the Holy Sanctum. Martha above. Brando counted all the items and swallowed dryly. He could already confirm that this dimensional hole was definitely something left behind by Amon. He originally thought that the High Priest's belongings had been completely destroyed by the Annihilation Black Hole, but he did not expect that fate would give him such a surprise at the last moment. Martha above praised the dimensional hole. He could not help but silently make a note of it in his heart. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 465. There were a total of 573 sets of armor from the Temple of Light in the dimensional space. These were used by the monk's soldiers, and they were all bronze-grade equipment. There were also a few sets of silver-grade armor for the Knight of the Temple. There were life crystals and anti-magic circles on them, which could protect vital parts from attacks and increase magic resistance. Among the standard equipment, these were considered very high-quality goods. There were also weapons, mainly two-handed swords and long swords. The shiny blades were branded with the symbol of a flame, which was also a product of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Brando thought about it carefully and knew that these things must have been prepared by Amon for the rebels of the Tree Herders. Now that they had become his spoils of war, he could use them to equip the White Lion Legion. Of course, he had to think of a way to change their appearance. These standard equipment were neatly stacked together. Not far from them, there was another pile of messy equipment floating in the dimensional space. These should be the spoils of war that Amon had obtained from the enemy. However, there were no high-quality goods, and it seemed that Amon didn't care much about these things. He didn't even bother to organize them, and just casually piled them into a pile. However, Brando was slightly surprised because he saw a silver accessory with a dark black gem floating outside the pile of equipment. It seemed to have been put in last. He was very familiar with all kinds of equipment. As soon as he saw it, he felt that it looked familiar. He couldn't help but reach out and grab it. Only then did he see that the black gem in the center of the silver accessory had a silver rune that seemed to be naturally formed. This is... Brando recognized that this was a high-grade amulet. This amulet was called Tears of the Lich. The equipment level was actually above fantasy. When he looked at the effects, the corners of his eyes couldn't help but twitch. Tears of the Lich, item level 300 OZ hardens the skin, increases HP by 300, defense by 1, necromancy curse by 1. Activation rune, instantly cast a spell below circle 8. 0/30, so that's how it is. It's actually this thing. There was no doubt that this was what Amon had relied on to instantly cast several defensive spells. Seeing the 0/30 energy pool at the back, Brando knew that this thing should be similar to the Ring of the Wind Empress. Every instant cast would consume a bit of energy, and the total energy limit was 30. Once it was used up, it would take some time to refill. However, it would take a few hours to fill up the Ring of the Wind Empress. Who knew how long this thing would take? But even so, this thing was abnormal enough. Not only could it instantly cast a total of 30 circle spells, but it also provided a shocking amount of attributes. 300 HP, plus 1 defense, and a level 1 undead curse. Before the perfect body, the character's HP was equivalent to the basic HP, plus the level correction and the constitution multiplied by 2. As a warrior, one of the most tanky professions, Brando's HP was only about 411 at the moment. Wearing this thing directly doubled his HP. He couldn't help but exclaim in his heart. No wonder Amon was like a cockroach. He was clearly a mage, but he was still fine after taking a few hits from him. Damn it, with this equipment, even if he couldn't catch up to a warrior of the same level, he would at least be on par with a ranger. Brando couldn't help but wipe the cold sweat off his forehead. There were too many strange equipment in the amber sword. Judging by common sense, you could fail miserably at any time. This sentence was true. However, Brando also knew that although this amulet looked a little abnormal, it was still a high-level equipment. Normally speaking, an equipment with a level 300 energy rating should only be available after level 5 or 60 for a single profession. The highest energy rating he had on him was Halran Gaia, which was over 100. An average person at his level would only be able to equip an item of around 300 energy rank. If he were to wear this amulet, he would probably have to strip naked and run around naked. But this wasn't a problem for him. After Andesha used the blood of gods to mess with his body, it wasn't strange to say that his body was no different from a monster's. Even if he didn't rely on any level adjustments, his 124 willpower allowed him to equip up to 1,240 ounces. Basically, he was on par with a single level 100 character. It was too easy for him to equip equipment that was 20 or 30 levels above him. Since that was the case, Brando naturally wouldn't be polite and directly put away the amulet. After taking stock of the equipment in the dimensional cave, it had only been a minute or two since he had entered the pit. But at this moment, footsteps could be heard from the fog outside. Scarlet. Brando thought for a moment and felt that it was unlikely. Scarlet's footsteps weren't that heavy, so it should be a man. He thought for a moment and casually put the fragment of the Book of Mavakart back into the dimensional hole, then bound the silver line with his psychic energy. This way, as long as he was still alive, no one would be able to open the dimensional hole. After all, dimensional holes were different from dimensional bags. Dimensional holes were at least 1,000 times more expensive than dimensional bags in the Amber Sword, but the volume of the two was similar. This was because dimensional bags were too easy to break. Although they had dimensional attributes, the outer layer of the bag was about the same as a normal dimensional bag. Once it was broken, the player would often have to pay a huge price. In the past, Brendel had seen some extremely wretched people who simply stuffed their multidimensional pouch into their underwear to ensure that the person was there and the multidimensional pouch was there. Of course, this was the wisdom of the general public. After all, there was no such thing as the most wretched player, only the more wretched ones. As he was thinking about these messy things, the footsteps above his head were getting closer and closer. Brando looked up and squinted his eyes to see a tall figure appear behind the fog. As he expected, it was Greysword Saint Mephistopheles. "You'd better come and see this." Mephistopheles stood on the pit and looked down at him. The middle-aged man's grayish-brown eyes were still a little too calm, so calm that a needle would fall without a sound. It was as if he had chased Brando and Scarlet all over the mountain earlier was an illusion. The Ash Sword Saint didn't care at all. Brando didn't know how this guy's personality was developed, but it seemed that he was really arrogant. How should he put it? A little too proud. But he had to admit that without this kind of pride in his bones, how would he dare to challenge an entire empire? What's going on? There's something under the ruins. Something. If he wasn't mistaken, this square should be a gathering place for the ancient silver folk. It was just a market, so what could be under the market? But Brando wouldn't jump to conclusions. He nodded to Mephistopheles and climbed out of the pit. "You're not guarding against that man?" Orthless asked in his mind. "Don't worry, I know this guy better than Veronica," Brando replied. With the Ash Sword Saint's personality, he wouldn't even bother to make a sneak attack. If it wasn't for the matter of revenge against the Empire, he wouldn't even look at him. Besides, they were now in the same boat, and Mephistopheles was a man of his word. He would never do something like humiliating himself. Brando climbed up, and as expected, Mephistopheles watched him from beginning to end. But Brando's unguarded behavior still surprised him. It was definitely not an act. People who could do this were either idiots or geniuses. Of course, Brando didn't look like an idiot. Otherwise, the Amon who had just died would probably come back to life in anger. Then, the only possibility left was that he was a genius. The Sword Saint in the eyes of others didn't show any emotion on his face, but he never stopped scheming in his mind. Of course, he didn't consider the possibility of success or failure in his deal with Veronica, but he never considered the possibility of relying on others. As long as Brando agreed to give him 1/3 of the territory, he could build this country on his own. But now, after seeing Brando's performance, Mephistopheles' heart wavered a little. Perhaps cooperating with this young man wasn't a bad thing after all. It was always pleasant to work with smart people. Besides, Brando was only in his early 20s, and he already had such achievements. Perhaps the future dukedom would need his protection. Of course, Mephistopheles wasn't stupid enough to think that he could live forever. That was the thought of those who thought they were the center of the world. After his death, whether the dukedom could continue to exist or whether he could find a suitable successor was still unknown. Brando came up to him and asked, "Where is it?" Of course, he didn't know that Mephistopheles' mind was in turmoil. His original thoughts had changed several times, and this change was reflected in his tone. "It's here. I'll take you to see it." Brando was stunned and looked at him with some surprise. The place Mephistopheles found was in a corner of the plaza. The place had been destroyed by Andesha in the previous battle, revealing a dark space below. The golden brambles that had been rapidly growing had already extended in this direction. The dense, thorny branches extended into the depths of the pit as if they had been growing for thousands of years. If one did not look carefully, they would not have noticed that there was a man-made path at the bottom of the pit. This place was actually discovered by Scarlet, Sifrid, and Mephistopheles. They were guarding the entrance to the golden thorns. When Brando looked down, he immediately sucked in a breath of cold air. It's an underground city. The first thing he saw was a layer of something that looked like a crystal sheet, about 2 fingers thick and a few meters wide, in the middle of the fault. These things appeared like a crystal lattice on the surface of the tunnel below. Brando had seen many things in his life, and he knew at a glance that it was a channel used to transmit energy. This meant that there was a center that supplied magic energy below the plaza. After a bit of analysis, he came to the conclusion that the entire Valhalla's control center was in the underground city below. The buildings on top of the World Tree seemed to be nothing more than a smokescreen. As for the so-called underground control center, as well as the center of the magic energy, Brendel could only think of one possibility after thinking about it. The flame seed. "Mr. Sword Saint, I think you've found the big guy," he muttered to himself as he looked at the dark tunnel below. The crystal lattice patterns in the tunnel extended in a single direction. There was no doubt that as long as he followed these patterns, he would be able to easily find the final destination. Note: the amulet increases necromancy curses by 1. Similar to the D2 bonus, the amulet can only be used when the character has mastered the corresponding skill. This was slightly different from the Lion's Medal's conflict aura. Valhalla's chapters will probably end in 3 or 4 chapters. The battles and adventures have basically come to an end. It's mainly because the story dragged on for too long, and I spent a lot of time organizing my thoughts. So, I'm giving you a heads up. To be continued. If you like this story, you're welcome to come to Cheatien.com to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 466. After entering the underground from the broken corner of the ruins, what appeared before his eyes was a huge underground world. Long and thin corridors connected one after another to warehouses, hideouts, and war preparation fortresses. This was obviously the defense line of the underground city on the surface. He had seen such a defense line in the Kurlut's Leont mountain fortress and the elves' underground ruins, but it was far from being as perfect as this one. The walls of the corridors were made of the toughest rocks, and the crystalline patterns on them extended all the way to the deepest part of the underground. This style of architecture was incompatible with Wone's aesthetic standards, as if it was the legacy of a prehistoric civilization that had been dormant for eons. It gave Brando a sense of familiarity. If the surrounding rocks were replaced with metal, Brando would have thought that he was walking in a huge underground research center. Weren't the crystalline networks used to transmit energy? The futuristic style combined with the thick historical aura of the eroded rocks gave off a sense of sacredness. He could not help but sigh. The designer of the amber sword setting was indeed a world-class master. Brando appreciated everything from the perspective of a player. It was a completely different feeling from the others. Scarlet and Sifrid, who were following closely behind him, were stunned speechless. It was as if they were holding their breaths. They were deeply shocked by the ancient civilization. Mephisto, the Ash Sword Saint, was in a slightly better state. However, as he observed his surroundings, his gray eyes flashed with surprise from time to time. Brando's carefree attitude surprised Orthlis. It was the first time she had seen such a well-preserved silver civilization's ruins. It was as if the people were gone, and the ruins still had the aura of the previous era. Brando, on the other hand, seemed to be used to it. She noticed that his gaze was filled with appreciation and familiarity. It was an expression that transcended others. In fact, that was indeed the case. There was a soul in his body that transcended this world. Coming to the ruins of the ancient civilization, other people would feel sacred, solemn, and shocked, but Brando felt a sense of familiarity. It was as if he had returned home. It was as if a few players were greeting him with a smile. "Hey buddy, wanna join us for an adventure?" Brando's lips curved into a smile. "Yes, I can't go back to Earth anymore." But the world of Vaunt, which was interwoven in his dreams, always reminded him of what had happened. "Kid, tell me seriously. Are you one of Erwin's people?" Orthlis suddenly asked. Brando snapped out of his daze. Why did she ask that? Could it be that Orthlis had discovered his true identity? It seemed impossible at first, but Brendel could not help but feel a little guilty. "Why do you ask?" "Look at the difference between you and them." Orthlis pointed at Scarlet and Sifrid, who were completely dumbfounded. "How can a normal person be like you? Even if scholars have read similar descriptions in books, shouldn't they be in awe when they see the real thing? But Brando, you're just admiring them. It's as if you're a master leading a guest around his luxurious villa. Tell me honestly, are you a descendant of the Silver Clan?" Orthlis's eyes flashed with suspicion. It was obvious that she had been suspecting him for a long time. But Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. He did not think that Orthless would think of something like this. What the hell is going on? But he immediately shook his head. Of course not. I'm a descendant of Erwin. My ancestors were even nobles. Does Erwin's nobility mean anything to me? What a joke. The Wind Empress glared at him. Although Brando's words had dispelled her doubts, she had not completely given up, but even if you're a descendant of the Silver Clan, it doesn't matter. The more powerful the successor, the more gratified I will be. Of course, he wouldn't say that he didn't want to become a silver person because he didn't want to be too different from Freya and Roman. He looked back at Scarlet again, and the others around him did the same. They passed through layers of defense and gradually went deeper into the underground. Deep in the rock formation, the sound had become extremely slow. The temperature had risen a little, but the surroundings were quiet. After a while, Brando heard the sound of water dripping in the distance. He estimated that there were at least 3 lines of defense near the surface. It was built like a maze, and thanks to his experience, he was able to pass through it without wasting time. After passing through the stronghold system on the surface, they should be in the living area of the underground city. The underground city was similar to the city on the surface. There were residential areas, commercial areas, meeting places, temples, palaces, and a huge drainage system. He had seen such cities in the hometown of the mountain dwarves. He also knew that the monsters in the underground drainage system would occasionally come to the upper areas and become the mission targets of the players. However, the underground city had water for a long time. Other than the drainage system, underground rivers, underground streams, and seepage ponds, there was only the auditorium. The so-called auditorium was equivalent to the square on the surface. In the middle of the square, there were usually seepage ponds and springs. The auditorium connected the residential area and the commercial area, providing water for a considerable area nearby. Therefore, when they heard the sound of water dripping here, it meant that they were not far from the central area of the underground city. After walking in the dark for about a minute with the glowing gem in his hand, the light in Brando's hand suddenly scattered in all directions. The low rock walls around them suddenly disappeared, and they walked into a wide underground space. The light in front of them scattered on the ground, revealing a huge square paved with uneven stone slabs. In the middle of the square was a spring, and the spring water was still flowing slowly even after thousands of years. However, the rock platform around the spring had been eroded and riddled with holes. The water overflowed the top of the platform and overflowed into the square, forming a large area that was sunken and submerged. It's a square. It's just as you said, Brother Brando. Sifrit exclaimed. Scarlet also looked at Brando with admiration. In her eyes, even though he was young, he was a very knowledgeable scholar. Compared to the other nobles who only knew how to be jealous and indulge in sensual pleasures at this age, Brendel was already able to converse with the likes of the Ash Sword Saint and Veronica on an equal footing. He was even able to guide them in terms of knowledge. Yes. Brando nodded. He was also a little excited. If they found the auditorium, it meant that they were not far from their goal. Especially since the auditorium was so large, it must be connected to a palace or a temple. He looked up and looked at the dense holes in the walls, hoping to find the symbol he was familiar with. He first found the holy emblem of the Holy Cathedral. Won's belief in the past had not changed, and Lady Martha had always been protecting the intelligent beings of the land. Although the appearance of the holy emblem had more or less changed due to different aesthetic standards, the holy woman in the middle of the emblem was easily recognizable. Soon, the group of people walked around the square once. At this time, Brando's eyes suddenly lit up. It's here. He found that the tunnel leading to the palace was on the opposite side of the central axis of the square. The palace was the core of the dungeon and also the center of defense. If the fire seed could exist in this dungeon, the ancient silver folk would definitely place it in the center of the city. The goal of this dangerous trip was right in front of him. Even with Brando's experience, he could not help but feel a little anxious. Veronica and Mephisto only thought that this was a new place to guard, but Brando knew the true meaning of the Flame Seed's existence. Therefore, he could give up 1/3 of the land to the Ash Sword Saint without hesitation, but it was absolutely impossible for him to give up the biggest secret here. That was his biggest hope of saving Nehruin. He took a deep breath, and couldn't help but walk up in quick steps. But at this time, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles suddenly grabbed him. A black shadow rushed toward them. Mephisto pulled out the great sword on his back and slashed at the shadow. With a loud clang, Brendel saw that the black shadow that was sent flying was actually a giant scythe that came slashing down from the ceiling. The scythe was shining with a strange light, and it must have been imbued with a powerful spell. If it hit, even an elemental rancor would not be able to withstand it. He could not help but break out in a cold sweat. He was so excited that he forgot the most basic thing, a trap. Of course, with his reaction speed, this thing would not hit him. But Mephisto's actions had won him over. This meant that the Ash Sword Saint was indeed planning to be on the same boat as him. He calmed down and nodded to Mephisto. "Be careful," the Ash Sword Saint said calmly. "Okay." After avoiding the first trap, the path behind was indeed full of thorns. But then, it was Brando's own show. He was neither a nightingale nor a rogue, so he did not have the special ability to detect traps. But even if he had not eaten meat, he had seen pigs run. Brando's experience as a level 130 warrior was rich. What kind of underground city had he not explored? What kind of trap had he not seen before? He had even been to the ruins of the Gold Folk, let alone the ruins of a level 60 silver civilization. In comparison, Valhalla was just a little more well-preserved, but those traps were nothing new to him. With a casual glance, he could see how a trap worked. He led the group of people through the underground tunnel as if they were taking a leisurely stroll in the park. Mephisto was not familiar with Brando, so he naturally thought that he was an expert in mechanical engineering. But to Scarlet and Siegfried, it was a completely different story. In their eyes, Brendel's halo had increased by another ring. Orthless could not understand how a young man like him could be so proficient in everything. It also did not make sense based on the amount of time he had spent studying. The underground palaces of the Silver Ancestors were distributed horizontally and vertically. They were not complicated or extravagant. The main structure was still made of stone, and the smooth surface of the floor was covered in a network of crystals that extended into the darkness. The only difference was that the interior of the palace was much larger and wider than the outside. There were even rectangular pillars in the middle of the palace that required a dozen people to wrap their arms around. Energy transmission networks spread out between the pillars like a spider's web, and there were signs that they were getting denser. Suddenly, Brando's eyes followed the light from the gemstone in his hand. His vision went past about 30 pillars that formed a circle, and a huge lighthouse appeared in the middle. Brando had thought that it was a lighthouse when he first saw it. In the dark space, a huge pyramid stood quietly. However, at the top of the pyramid, there was a rather huge shuttle-shaped crystal floating. It was at least 20 meters tall, and the widest part was almost the same as the height. The crystal flashed like ripples, and soft light came out of these ripples. Although it was extremely weak, it could still illuminate the area around the pyramid. Everyone was speechless when they saw this scene. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.